Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ashen Souls, Fallen Hearts in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, The Dawning. The battlefield swarmed. Countless soldiers ran against countless opponents, blades raised high and cries of triumph and sorrow filling the air. The ground was slick from recent rainfall, and the blood that spilled to the grass and dirt mingled with the water and mud to create a rusty mix that only claimed more lives as the seconds crawled on. At the center of the chaos, a sword shone with the light of the moon. The woman who held it was the one in control of the battle, the world revolving around her whether everyone else wanted to admit it or not. The fight ebbed and flowed as she cut through her foes, and any who dared to contest her were met with a swift stab to the chest before they crumpled to the ground. She gave no second thoughts to her enemies, instead only pushing through in the name of victory. This was all she had been hoping to accomplish over the years of war that had consumed her homeland, and today, she would come out the victor. I stand from atop the cliff, staring out over the battlefield below. Dark magic crackles across my fingertips before I push my arm forward, and black magic explodes on all sides before raining down on the marsh below. Screams rent the air once again, and I simply smile to myself. She could try all she wanted, but she would not succeed. She never won against me. Never. Hey. Are you there? The voice was a familiar one, and Shay Magdalene groaned as she sat up and rubbed at her temple. It was a similar dream to those she had been seeing over the course of the last few weeks, always some variation of a fight from a time long gone that she could never hope to understand. The images were already fading away before she could even think of capturing them, not that Shay gave much care to it. She yawned, stretching her arms high before letting her hands fall back into her lap. Overhead, the sun was slowly starting to set as night arrived. That would be when the mission began in full. Since the fighting was due to take place overnight, everyone in the mercenary company had to get some rest during the day. Shay hadn't expected herself to drift off for that long though. Normally she was much more punctual than that. Her dreams had been distorting her perceptions of time lately though, and she couldn't quite push through the haze no matter how hard she tried. She also hadn't been expecting to be met with a face when she awoke. Getz stood above her, crossing his arms, and Shay yelped, falling sideways onto the grass before she could steady herself. "Did you really need to sneak up on me like that?" She grumbled under her breath. She pushed herself back up against the tree she had curled under, realizing belatedly that a few strands of grass had wound up caught in her purple hair. Shay sighed and started to pull the green away, flicking each strand off her finger once she was done with it. "I would have thought you would know better than to drift off right before a mission," Getz told her. "We're getting closer to leaving. The boss was looking for you. It wouldn't do if somebody wound up running off when we're about to see the biggest mission of our lives." Shay groggily nodded. That was right. This wasn't just any old mission. They were up against Geralt's mercenaries, perhaps one of the strongest groups of mercenaries across all of Fodlan. They were high in demand and complete terrors on the battlefield, and they were set to be Shay's enemies for the night. Two nobles had taken to squabbling recently over territorial boundaries, and that apparently meant they had to fight. Shay hadn't asked many questions about it, knowing there wasn't much of a point. She didn't know much about politics, nor did she particularly care to know more about it. She just knew they had to fight, and she was all too happy to follow up on that arrangement. "I'm ready, Getz," Shay promised her comrade as she rose to her feet. Her body complained at the sudden movement, and she wondered just how deep she had gotten into her dream. "How soon are we going to start fighting?" "Within the hour, I assume," Getz replied. "And you had better get all that tension out before we head off to the battlefield. We're going to be up against the Ashen Demon." There was another name every mercenary in Fodlan had heard before. The Ashen Demon was perhaps the most terrifying member of Geralt's mercenaries, and given how intimidating the company already was, that was certainly saying something. She fought like a demon rather than a person, hence how she had earned her title. Shay didn't even know her name. All she knew was the fact that the Ashen Demon was a complete terror on the battlefield, but despite it all she had no intentions of letting her come out victorious from this fight. "Like that's going to stop us," Shay muttered with a loose snort. "She can be as strong as she wants. I'm not going to let her get in the way of our mission. This is a huge task, and it wouldn't do if we let her get the better of us." That's the optimism I like to hear. Shay perked up at the sound of her captain's voice. Berling was the leader of the company, and she was damn good at her job too. Out of all the mercenary leaders Shay had worked with over the years, Berling was no doubt the best commander she had ever seen. If anybody was going to stand a chance against the Ashen Demon, it was going to be Berling. As far as Shay was concerned, the Ashen Demon was going to see her first defeat at Berling's hands, reputation be damned. Berling walked casually over to Shay and gets everything about her the picture of confidence. Once this battle is over, we can kick back and have a nice mug of ale while relishing in our victory, she went on. That means beating the Ashen Demon first though, and I'm ready to give her a first taste of defeat. It's high time somebody humbles her. Shay was about to chime in with agreement, but she was cut off by the arrival of a third member of the mercenary company. Lazai was one of their main officers as well, Berling's right hand and their primary scout leader. Lazai saluted to Berling before speaking. Enemy activity on the horizon, she exclaimed. The mercenaries are here. You know what that means, Berling declared to her allies with a smile. This is what we've been training for. Tonight, we're going to go down in history as the first group to ever defeat Geralt's mercenaries in a fight. Tonight, we're going to celebrate the Ashen Demon's first ever failure in combat. Shay, Lazai, and Getz rose up in cheers at that, and Berling nodded her approval before walking off to take to the front lines. Lazai was quick to follow after her, but Getz hung back for a few moments, nudging Shay in the side with his elbow. Good luck out there, he told her. Shay snorted as she tied her hair back and out of her face. Like I'm going to need it, she said. Getz snickered before he walked after Lazai and Berling, and Shay reached for her blade where it rested at her hip. This was going to be a fight to remember. One day, everyone would know the tale of triumph of Berling's mercenaries. She could feel it. This was only the beginning. When night fell, chaos took control. Shay had spent many years honing her craft on the battlefield. She knew what it meant to fight for survival, and swinging a blade was the first way she had learned how to do it. In a world that gave her little, she had to bite and kick to earn her purchase, and from her experience, it all came down to her sword, her instincts, and her actions in the heat of the moment. Fighting was how she had gotten this far. Fighting bitterly was how she had been able to join Berling's team in the first place. Shay's years of wandering throughout Leicester had taught her quite a bit about the world around her. She knew just about every mercenary company living in Fodlan's eastern half either from having fought with them or having been a part of the team. Berling led only the best into combat, and Shay had earned her place there. She hadn't seen a battle she couldn't win in at least the last 2 years, an impressive accomplishment given she was only 21. Shay still had a long way to go, but she knew her way around a fight at the very least, and that was what mattered most. Combat was simple, Shay had learned years ago. She had honed her skills greatly since she first took to the battlefield, but she still knew well that fighting was a simple matter, at least on paper. All she had to do was swing her blade and make sure nobody else got a good strike in on her. It was much harder in practice, but she knew the basics well enough to keep herself upright. She hadn't gotten herself killed yet, so she had to be good for something. Fighting was just about the only thing Shay was good at if she was being honest, and if she couldn't keep herself together under the pressure, then what good was she? It was all too easy and welcoming for her to fall into a routine with the rest of Berling's mercenaries. Shay was one of the leading commanders of the group, the youngest leader of sorts to ever end up under Berling's tutelage, but she wasn't going to be taking charge tonight. Berling herself was leading the charge, so Shay's job was clean up duty from the back. In other words, it was easy. All she had to do was swing her sword and keep from getting hit. Simple. Simple. As soon as the fight began, Shay found herself faced against a man who had at least a good 6 inches over her. She ducked beneath a slash in her direction before following it up with an upward strike that sent the man staggering. Shay got in close before she hit his sword hand with the hilt of her blade, forcing him to drop his blade. Shay kicked him to the ground easily from there, pointing a sword at his throat. She only pulled away when the man scrambled away, clearly not planning on messing with her again. Shay was about to go in for a final attack to make sure he didn't cause any other problems, but she was interrupted when yet another strike came for her head. She whipped to face the assailant just in time to slide out of the way, and from there, All it took was another quick pair of slashes to get the newcomer off her back. Shay sighed to herself before turning her attention forward. The two noble houses were competing over this expanse of land in a small fortress found at the center of it all. If Shay had to guess, her job was going to be to cut through to that central structure, defeat the commanders along the way, and claim it for her employer. Once again, it was easy and simple. Doing it was the harder part, but Shay didn't mind that quite so much. This was just another job. It was dangerous, yes, but this was the same old work Shay had been doing for years up to this point. She could handle it. Shay had first taken up mercenary work when she was 15. Her adoptive mother had passed away recently after struggling with sickness for 6 months, and Shay had needed a way to handle herself in the wake of it all. She found that she had a natural inclination for the blade, and from there, it felt like everything slipped right into place. It was simple for her from the beginning, like she had been fighting from the day she was born. Nothing could get in her way as she rose through the ranks of different mercenary companies in Leicester. Even the occasional failure meant nothing to her in the long run. She was stable, and even fighting against Geralt's mercenaries wasn't going to change that. Shay quickly proved this point by raising her sword and bringing it down against another man's axe. Swords naturally overpowered axes thanks to their speed and control, allowing Shay to effortlessly push the man back before sending him flying by a pair of quick slashes. She didn't give him a second thought as she pressed right ahead. The fortress had to be getting closer, right? After dispatching of another 5 or so mercenaries who dared to step in her way, Shay glanced up and saw the central fortress on the horizon. She smiled to herself before dodging another attack and continuing her dash forward. As far as she could tell, Berlin had to be up there leading the primary charge. Shay was certain she would run into the others soon enough as long as she kept up the pace. When Shay was sure her back was secured and that nobody was going to ambush her from behind, she jogged up to the entrance of the fortress. It could barely even be called that, if she was being honest. The walls were crumbling to the ground haphazardly, leaving behind piles of stone and vines that curled around the rocks easily. This territory dispute had little to do with the fort itself though, instead more about the land it sat upon. Either way, it didn't matter what the nobles of Fodlan did. As far as Shay was concerned, they were impossible to understand, distant dragons that sat atop piles of gold they handed out to their employees. She didn't want to try to understand the way their minds worked, and so, she ignored the crumbling exterior of the fortress and pressed on through the vine-covered halls of the building. That was when a scream pierced the air. Shay was used to hearing the cries of death on the battlefield. She had desensitized herself to it years ago, knowing there was nothing she could do to stop that in her line of work. However, she was used to hearing it from enemies more than anyone else. That voice though. That was familiar. Lazai. Shay's blood ran cold, and when 2 other mercenaries appeared on either side of her, she didn't hesitate to dash behind one of them to stab him in the shoulder. The man shrieked at the blade in his back before Shay pushed him forward with the side of sword. The mercenary stumbled into his comrade, and she gasped as they both fell to the ground. She instinctively picked him up and started to run, off to find a medic who would be able to stem the bleeding of the wound on his shoulder. Shay didn't care about them though. Instead, she kept running forward. Lazai couldn't have possibly been dead, right? Their group was the best in all of Leicester. Even if they were up against another powerful party of mercenaries, they were better than this. They were better than to be bested by Geralt's team, even if their enemies had the Ashen demon on their side. After the initial scream ran out, Shay didn't hear anything else from Lazai. The fortress was pure chaos, enemies and allies swarming around her like bees around a hive. She couldn't make out anything. There had to be a center to all of this, some peace in the calamity, but Shay couldn't find it no matter how hard she tried. Another cry pierced the skies, and Shay glanced up with hopes that the crumbling ceiling of the fort would reveal her answers. She shouldn't have been surprised when she saw nothing, and she forced herself to focus on the fight at hand. Her adrenaline rush was growing crueler and more brutal than ever before, and her hands were shaking no matter how much she tried to calm herself. She was used to death in combat. That was what happened in the life of a mercenary. Still, she couldn't calm herself down at the idea that Lazai, someone she had been talking to just an hour beforehand, if not even less than that, was gone. It couldn't be true. But Shay already knew the truth. "Why, you monster!" Somehow, Shay was able to pick out the familiar voice from among the crowd, and her grip on her sword grew tighter. That was the captain. Shay hadn't ever heard her sounding so weak and somber though, and she already knew something was wrong, desperately wrong. Shay struck at the man who dared to step closest to her, and she pushed through the chaos with nothing but her wits and her blade. No, this couldn't be happening. Berling was the strongest person Shay knew both on and off the battlefield. It couldn't be. Shay didn't realize what she was stepping over until her foot stumbled on the edge of the ground below, but it wasn't the rocks she had tripped on. No, it was something much more sinister. Lazai's body was still and lifeless on the ground below, her head tilted off to the side. A gaping wound rested at the center of Lazai's chest, no doubt from a powerful stab that had ended everything in a matter of seconds. Shay couldn't tell if it was better or worse that she couldn't see her friend's final expression, knowing Lazai's empty eyes would have haunted her forever, but also wishing she could have done that final dignity for her friend even in death. Shay's chest was growing tight, and the world felt like it was crumbling on top of her, and there was no way for her to fight her way out of it. She didn't have time to think about this though. If Lazai was gone, then that meant something must have happened to the captain too. Shay swallowed back her bitter fear and the wish to crawl under a rock until all of this blew over, instead pressing forward once again. It was almost impossible to make out the details of what was happening around her, but she knew the battle was much more intense than she could have ever imagined. This was well beyond her reach, and she knew it. It didn't take long for Shay to move to the entryway of the fortress central room, though pushing through that hallway felt like it took an eternity after she heard Berling's voice. Shay wished she could have been surprised when she looked down at the ground just outside the door and saw the captain sprawled out on the ground. Her eyes were lifeless and her expression horrified. Her gaze was unseeing as she stared up at the ceiling above, and Shay felt as if she was the one who had been stabbed through the chest instead of Berling. Much like with Lazai, all it had taken was a single stab to the chest to end Berling's life, and Shay could tell by the outline of the wound that the same sword had dealt both blows. The same person had killed both of her friends. Judging by the path the person had followed, they were probably inside the fortress center room. That was the only explanation Shay could think of. She didn't see any monsters of combat around here anywhere, and that meant they had to be deeper into the building. Shay already had an awful feeling about who she was going to end up facing, but she didn't care. She owed it to Lazai, Berling, and everyone else who had died during this fight to end the one who had ruined their futures. Vengeance had no place in a mercenary's life, but in that moment, Shay didn't feel like a mercenary. She knew that her friends were gone, and she had an obligation to do what she could so they could rest in peace. As soon as Shay entered the fortress central room, she wished she had never woken up that morning. Getz was suspended just above the ground, a sword sticking out of his chest. The blade had just barely missed his heart, but Shay knew he only had a few seconds left. He noticed she was standing there around the shock of impending doom, his eyes wide as he turned to face her. Run. While why you still see can. Before Shay could process his words, the sword was torn from his chest, and Getz didn't even have the time to cry out in pain before he crumbled to the ground, dead before he hit the stones. Shay's breathing only grew faster at the sight. She was as good as alone at this point, wasn't she? The one who had killed Berling, Lazai, and now Getz had taken out the three strongest fighters Shay had ever known. Anyone else who dared to go up against them was as good as gone too. The murderer in question was a woman a few inches shorter than Shay, but she carried herself completely differently. Shay regularly walked with a general aura of casual confidence, approachable and charming in a way that few people could replicate. This woman, on the other hand, was closed off and dark, everything Shay had never been. Her eyes felt empty, like she was seeing things around her but had no care for them. Her clothing was all dark, either deep gray or pitch black, and the blade in her hand was stained starkly with crimson blood. Lazai's blood. Berling's blood. Getz's blood. She barely even seemed to care about it at all, instead just standing there without a care in the world. Shay already knew exactly who she was. The Ashen Demon. Shay should have known. Of all the people in the world, the Ashen Demon was the one with the best chance of defeating the best fighters Shay had ever met. They had known it was risky to go up against her in the first place, but all of them had tempted fate, and they had paid for it. With this in mind, Shay should have known better. She should have known she wouldn't stand a chance. But in that moment, all of her mercenary instincts that told her to run, to preserve her own life above all else, fell flat. All that mattered was the one who had killed her friends, the sword in her hand, and the burning desire in her stomach to take revenge, bloody and gruesome. The power sparked to life before Shay could register what was happening. Every piece of her body surged with an electric energy she had never felt before, but she didn't fight against it. Nothing had ever felt quite this right. She had to take her revenge. She had to find a way to win. The Ashen demon didn't seem to care for Shay at first, but when she noticed what was happening, she expressed her first emotion since the start of the fight, shock. It only lasted for a moment though before she raised her sword and pressed forward. Shay raised her own blades to deflect, and it was when she brought the swords up that she realized she had two, one in each hand. When had that happened? One of them was sparking with an orange energy like molten lava, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she hadn't brought along any sword like that. Hell, she hadn't ever even seen a sword like that before. Shay would have asked for answers if she had the mental capacity to do so, but she didn't have the time or luxury of resting. This battle was going to be deadly if she wasn't careful. It probably already was. She just refused to give up or let that fact hold her back. The Ashen demon had much more strength than her appearance would have suggested. Her dark clothing concealed the bulk of her muscles, but Shay could feel her overwhelming power the longer their swords locked against one another. The Ashen demon raised her right foot before hooking it around Shay's ankle, forcing the purple-haired mercenary to the ground with a groan. The Ashen demon raised her blade high, ready to come in for the killing blow, but Shay rolled out of the way at the last minute. In doing so, she was able to avoid a few stray pieces of the ceiling overhead falling down to the ground with resounding echoes that rang in Shay's ears long after the dust had settled. No matter how overwhelming the noise was though, it was worth it to keep the Ashen demon stunned. For a few brief moments, Shay was able to push herself to her feet, and the Ashen demon was unable to reach her while she recovered. Still, that peace didn't last long, and the Ashen demon descended upon Shay in the blink of an eye. Shay tried to defend herself once again, but she couldn't quite get her sword high enough to deflect the hit. The Ashen demon slashed across Shay's torso with the latter's armor only barely managing to protect her from what could have been a fatal blow. Shay was playing with fire here, and it was amazing that she was keeping up at all. If she was being honest with herself, she shouldn't have been able to keep her footing against someone so overwhelmingly powerful. It shouldn't have been possible at all. The universe didn't take long at all to fulfill Shay's fears, and the Ashen demon used her free arm to grab at Shay's wrist before sending her backward. Shay cried out in pain when her back hit the awl, and agony began to pulse through her body from the back of her head. She wasn't sure if she was concussed, but she could say with certainty that this was a migraine that wouldn't be going away anytime soon. Then again, the migraine wouldn't matter much if she was dead, would it? Byleth. The captain says that we're retreating. Shay sucked in a breath as she looked to the entryway of the crumbling room. The Ashen demon looked over at the sound of what appeared to be her name. Understood, Byleth said simply before looking back to Shay. This fight is over. Another time, perhaps. Shay could barely believe what she was hearing, and the rage in her body began to spread once again. Wait! She screamed. She refused to look down at Berlin or Getz's bodies, but the memories of their dying eyes gave her all the motivation she needed to keep going. She peeled herself away from the wall even as crumbling pieces of the architecture began to rain on her head like small pellets of hail. Her torso throbbed and pounded with pain unlike anything she had ever felt before, but Shay didn't let herself listen to the constant pain. She had to press on. Everyone was counting on her to carry out her revenge. Byleth, however, didn't care much for her ideals of vengeance at all. In fact, she didn't even give Shay a second glance as she wiped her blade free of blood and slid it back into its sheath. The other mercenary saluted to her, giving Shay a sideways glance before following the demon of the battlefield out of the fortress. Shay didn't think she had ever felt so insignificant and underestimated. They didn't think she was worth their time at all, even if the fight had been declared over. This wasn't about the mission anymore. Who gave a damn about nobles fighting over some piece of territory? No, now, it was about justice, and Shay was desperate to exact it. Unfortunately, her body didn't agree with her ideals in the slightest. As Shay tried to pursue Byleth, every muscle in her body grew heavy, and the previous burst of fiery, explosive rage and adrenaline cooled off into an apathetic block of ice. She couldn't even bring herself to hold a sword anymore. The blade that looked like molten lava started to vanish, turning into ash before vanishing on the wind. The breeze from the holes in the ceiling rustled Shay's hair, and she realized her hair had taken on a new color pattern, a fading spectrum of red, orange, pink, and finally her natural purple. When had that happened? Was it a side effect of summoning that strange sword she had never seen before? How much else had happened when she wasn't paying attention? As soon as Shay's hair returned to its regular purple coloration, her knees gave out from beneath her, and the ground rushed up to meet her. For a few moments, all she could do was lay there, gasping heavily for air like she was coming down from an attempt at suffocation. Where had this exhaustion come from? Had the Ashen demon really done that much damage with just a few successful swings? Why did it feel like her ribs had been squeezed in somebody's fist and left as nothing but dust? Shay's questions slowly grew farther away as darkness creeped in from the edges of her vision. The night sky overhead bled into nothingness, and no matter how much Shay tried to ground herself against the uncomfortable warmth of the stones below, she couldn't bring herself to focus. Her body simply refused to listen to her commands. Is this what death feels like? And with that final thought, everything went black. Chapter 2, Awakening. When Shay next awoke, she was no longer in the crumbling fortress. It took a few heavy moments for her to pry her eyes open, and when she was finally able to examine her surroundings in full, she could barely believe what she was seeing. The stone walls and previews of the night sky overhead had been replaced by a gentle pattern that looked vaguely like stars. The background was an inky, deep purple with fluctuations of indigo and black scattered around. Chunks of white stone floated all around Shay, though she couldn't quite reach out to touch any of them. They were all out of her range, just barely, not that she bothered to reach for them to begin with. It was like she was stuck on the spot, unable to even make her body listen to her. For a few moments, Shay wondered if she had died. The ache from all over her body, the one that had consumed her while she fought against Byleth, had faded away. Instead, Shay felt nothing. It didn't even feel like her body was her own. She was still inside of her own skin, so she wasn't dissociating or anything similar, but it felt as if the world was simply far out of her reach. All she could do was move her head around and try to make sense of everything she was seeing. That was when a new silhouette came into view, floating just high enough above the ground to put them above Shay in terms of verticality. It was a person, though if Shay had to guess, she would have said they weren't much older than 14 years old. Something deep inside of her said they were far older than that, but she couldn't quite put a finger on where the instinct had come from. The person was pale, almost to the point of being white. Their hair was actually white and cut close to their face. Their clothing was complex and ornamental, flowing around them in a stream of endless white that only barely left space open for their feet and hands. Red marked the center of their chest and earrings that hid among their hair. Their eyes were the same piercing crimson color, staring straight at Shay with a complexity that made the mercenary's eyebrows raise. Everything about this strange person was familiar to her, but at the same time, she knew she had never met them before, at least not like this. It was like she already knew everything about them, but her mind was still too hazy from the battle for her to pull herself together enough to narrow down any details like names. For a few heavy moments, Shay just stared up at the person, blinking a few times. They let out a small scoff. "Oh, good. You can still move. You're still alive. I doubt I would have been able to sleep at night with your blood on my hands," the person said. Their lips twisted upward in a strange imitation of a smile that both felt childishly playful and noticeably mature. Everything about the person's demeanor was a contradiction, and all Shay could do was stare for a long moment. It wasn't until the person reached out and snapped one hand in front of her face that Shay was able to snap out of her trance. She flinched backward, looking down at their hand as they continued. "You can talk, you know. You don't need to just sit there staring," they pointed out. "Where am I?" Shay asked as soon as she was able to force her lips to move. Her heart skipped a beat from pure anxiety, and she once again tried to find anything to grasp onto in the endless void. She glanced down, realizing belatedly that she was standing on a tiny outcropping of white rock. It was the only chunk of stone that wasn't constantly moving around her in some way or another. The person before her, on the other hand, was floating, a constant bobbing motion up and down. Once again, Shay was halfway sure that she had died. But the person had said that she was alive, right? That had to mean something, or so she was hoping. "Who are you?" the person hummed. "You may call me Arvel," they replied, saying it in such a vague, cryptic way that Shay wasn't entirely sure if that actually was their name or not. "Am I dead?" Shay questioned, taking a small step forward. Once again, her body didn't feel like it belonged to her at all. She had to be dead. That was the only explanation for all of this. She had woken up in a world that felt like something a child would come up with as a rendition of hell. Maybe this was where the goddess sent people who didn't hold enough faith in her. Shay had never been the particularly religious sort, so it wouldn't have surprised her if this was punishment for going against the will of the goddess. Arvel let out a snort. "Of course you're not dead. I just told you that I'm relieved you still draw breath. I didn't think I would be able to sleep ever again if I knew I had sat back and let you die," they went on. The more Shay listened to their voice, the more confident she was that she had heard all of this before. No, she hadn't heard this speech specifically, but she had heard Arvel's voice at some point in the past. Shay continued to stare at Arvel for a long moment, knowing she should probably offer to say at least something else, but she couldn't get the words out. Arvel, on the other hand, was more than happy to lead the conversation on. "If you have nothing else to say, let me speak plain. You are fated to die, and I am currently the only one preventing that from happening. Not much holds you to the land of the living right now, but I do. Even if it's completely exhausting," Arvel continued. Shay blinked a few times. Not only had she wound up speaking with a mysterious entity after nearly dying, but they were getting on her for nearly getting killed too. This was not how she had expected the day to go. "Thank you," she forced herself to say, even though it felt like a poor response to Arvel's words. Then again, what would a good response have entailed? How was anyone supposed to gauge that to begin with? Arvel, however, didn't seem to mind at all. Instead, their eyes went wide in surprise. "Oh, my. That's the first time anyone has ever shown me gratitude. And I rather enjoy it," they admitted. After staring at Shay for a moment in her dumbfounded expression, they continued. "I won't be able to keep this up for much longer though. I think now is the time for you to rise to your feet and return to your life. Your body is waiting for you, and if you do not claim it again soon, well, you may very well lose everything." "My body," Shay repeated. She looked down at herself, and she realized just why none of this felt like it made any sense. She must not have been in her actual body, at least not anymore. Whatever this was, this painless imitation of reality, was not where she belonged. As soon as this revelation hit, Shay kicked herself inwardly for not figuring it out sooner. Of course this wasn't real. The world was filled with space rocks and contained a person who floated. None of it was real. Somehow, this was a figment of Shay's imagination, though she couldn't remember ever imagining anything quite like this before. "This is not the reality, you know. I'm not entirely sure of where we are, but this world is not the one you come from," Arvel explained. "The Ashen demon came within an inch of snuffing out your life. That was what brought you here. Now, you must awaken from your slumber, rise to your feet, and start anew." "Start anew," Shay echoed to herself. She looked down at her feet, wishing she understood just what she was going to do next with her life. "My captain and comrades are dead. The company is gone. All I can do now is start over." "You're much calmer than I would have expected," Arvel admitted, the corners of their lips spilling over downward. "I would have thought you would want revenge. To chase after the demon and pull her apart for what she did." Shay shrugged loosely. "I feel like I always knew this was how it was going to end," she confessed. "We're mercenaries. We fight for our lives each day, and we know the risk that comes with combat too. This is a part of the job. Our luck just ran out today, and now I'm the only one left." "Then what are you going to do?" Arvel questioned. "If you want to start over, then you need to have a plan in mind. Shay finally managed to raise one of her hands, and she stared at her palm. The best way to honor my fallen comrades is by training hard and growing even stronger. Then I'll crush Geralt's mercenaries and the Ashen demon for everything they did. That's what I'm going to live for from now on. Arvel smiled. I like your spirit. I expected no less from my partner in destiny. Shay raised an eyebrow. Your partner in destiny. I'm here to guide you, and I promise to help you find the strength to see your dreams realized, Arvel explained. They reached out and placed one hand on Shay's shoulder. The contact felt much more real than Shay would have expected given that they were both far from the world she had come to know so well. From this day forward, it'll be you and me against the world. No matter what, we stand together. Shay looked up at Arvel and nodded. Their eyes fell closed, and Shay followed suit. She couldn't see the distortion, but the world around her began to pinch and close in on itself, vanishing on the wind. Between the galaxy and the white stones, everything blended together, and Shay allowed the universe to blend. Before it gave way to the ceiling of the stone fortress. The first indicator that Shay was back in her body was the dull, pounding pain across her torso. She winced and curled one arm around her abdomen, though the action was sluggish and slow. Shay looked down and realized that something about her dream had started to mend her body. Arvel had said they were keeping her alive, and it seemed that was much more literal than Shay had expected. Their energy had fueled an increased healing process all across Shay's body, and she could finally move again. Shay blinked a few times to try and ground herself once again, and she turned over to face the ceiling. The first few rays of sunlight were starting to peek over the horizon, and Shay wondered how long she had been asleep. It had only felt like a few minutes when she was speaking with Arvel, but the world around her implied something different. No matter how many times Shay tried to refocus herself, it never seemed to work. Stand up. Shay yelped in shock at the sound of the voice, and her breathing sped its pace immediately. She glanced around to see where the noise had come from only for an exasperated sigh to reach her ears. Oh, you're being ridiculous. You're going to have to get used to this. After a few seconds, Shay managed to calm herself once again, and she realized the voice belonged to Arvel. Still, when she looked around, she couldn't see any signs of them. Arvel? She asked softly. I'm still here, Arvel began, and Shay could hear the roll of their eyes even without needing to see them. I cannot appear in the physical world in the same way that you can. We share a body, and as such, I cannot take control without claiming it from you. Still, I know everything you do since we share a mind as well. I'll always be here for you. I'll always be listening. Shay nodded. That's going to take some getting used to, she murmured. She rolled Arvel's words over in her head a few times before gasping. Hold on a moment. Were you the one who took control earlier when I was fighting against Byleth? It didn't feel like I was the one doing that, but somebody must have been fighting. That was me, Arvel confirmed. You needed help, and that desperation was what awakened me in the first place. From now on, whenever you need me, all you need to do is say the word. Our minds and bodies are forever intertwined, and we shall fight as such from this day forward. Shay smiled. The idea of always having someone at her side was much nicer than she would have expected, even if Arvel couldn't appear physically. She had spent much of her life wandering from mercenary company to mercenary company, never keeping anyone around for long. That was the way of the mercenary. It would certainly be different to know there would always be someone at her side in the form of Arvel, but who was she to complain? She had just lost everything, but here was a chance to make a new life. She couldn't refuse that. Partners in destiny, Shay murmured to herself. Even as her body protested in pain, she started walking toward the entrance of the fortress, deliberately avoiding the blood seeping into the stones beneath her feet. Arvel simply smiled. Partners in destiny. When Byleth opened her eyes, she was in a place she had never seen before. The world around her was black with emerald green smoke rolling in around her feet. Somehow, the fog was glowing, the primary source of light in the darkened space. Byleth tried to take a step forward, but she found herself glued to the spot. The only thing she could move was her head, and she shifted her attention elsewhere. Something else was illuminating the room, glowing much brighter than the green fog. A massive, dark stone structure stretched up high behind Byleth, so tall that she had to crane her neck in order to see the top. Much of the throne was made of stairs that led up to a simple chair with a swirl adorning the back. The top of the throne gleamed with a lighter green than the rest, casting a gentle light over the body of the sole other occupant of the darkened realm. The girl was young, appearing 12 at the absolute oldest, though Byleth couldn't quite put a finger on her exact age. Something about the girl felt familiar, not that Byleth could describe where the two would have met before. She was sure she would have remembered meeting an impressive character like this. The girl's silhouette was distinct with long, thick green hair falling behind her in a gentle curtain. Pink and white threads were woven into her hair where they fell from a purple and golden crown that rested on her head. Her clothing was primarily a deep indigo and fell behind her in a large skirt adorned with gold. A matching string of gold fell down the front of her torso, and Byleth couldn't help but be impressed with how ornamental the entire ensemble was. It took Byleth a moment to realize, but the girl appeared to be dozing off on the spot. She had her face pressed into one hand, her elbow resting against the side of her throne. Her green eyes flew at half-mast before slowly peeling themselves open. "I wonder how you got here," she murmured before pulling herself to her full height. Byleth blinked a few times, trying to figure out if this truly was happening or if it was some dream. Once again, it hit Byleth just how familiar the girl was even though they had never spoken to one another before. It was like Byleth had known this girl her entire life, not that she would know how that was the case. "Who are you?" Byleth questioned. She tried to take a step forward, to get closer to the throne, but something seemed to hold her back. It took a few tries for her to succeed, and she realized along the way just how heavy every piece of her body felt. It was like she was being pulled down to the ground by 3 lead weights on each limb, and all Byleth could do was stare up at the girl. "You may call me Suthies. Though I am also referred to as the Beginning," the girl replied. She seemed surprised even by her own words once she had spoken, and she stared down at her hands, suddenly much more awake than she had been a few moments prior. I wonder where that came from. I do not remember who called me that, but I am sure it was once true." Byleth tilted her head ever so slightly to the side, and Suthies coughed into her hand before correcting herself. For someone so small, Suthies had endless grace, her posture always perfect. It was almost terrifying just how much effort and energy had been put into her appearance, especially given how little time Byleth bothered spending on her own outward looks. "Something about you feels so familiar, but I do not remember where from. Would you be able to fill me in?" Byleth shook her head, finding that movement was starting to come much easier now that she was fully grounded in this strange place. It didn't feel like reality, not really, so it took her much longer than she would have liked to focus once more. "I'm afraid I know as little as you," Byleth answered. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the area. The green fog was continuing to roll in from all directions, but Byleth couldn't quite tell where it was coming from specifically. "Do you know where we are?" Suthies paused, and she glanced around herself at the chair she currently sat at. "You stand before my throne," she eventually said. "Yes, that is right. This is my throne." She brushed one hand across the stone, almost as if she thought touching at the rock would make her words seem more realistic. She barely seemed to believe what was coming out of her mouth, almost like it was purely muscle memory. "Your throne," Byleth murmured to herself. She forced herself to walk forward by a few paces, and she touched at the rock as well. The stone was smooth, and Byleth could only imagine the countless hours of work that would have had to go into constructing something so poised. Byleth didn't think much of matters like this, but she was confident everything about this throne and about Suthies, for that matter, was well beyond her regular sense of comprehension. "Precisely," Suthies confirmed, forcing herself to look away from the chair and down to Byleth. "Do you know how you came to be here?" She paused for a moment, looking down at Byleth like she was trying to scrutinize some new information the Mercenary herself did not even understand. "What is your name?" "Byleth," the blue-haired mercenary replied. "As for how I appeared here, I don't know." She racked her own mind for any traces of evidence that would point her to the truth. She had gone out on a mission earlier with her father and the rest of the mercenaries. It had been some matter about 2 nobles fighting over territory, Not that Byleth bothered herself much with the details. She didn't understand the inner workings of nobility nor their politics, and she didn't bother to pay too much attention to it either. All that mattered was the fight when she had to take to the battlefield. Speaking of the fight, they had won. In fact, it had been a resounding victory with no challenges to speak of. The opposing company was strong, but they were nothing when compared to Geralt's team. That general train of thought seemed to apply to just about every powerful group the mercenaries came up against these days. Over the years, Geralt had honed his craft perfectly, and those under his command knew exactly what they had to do in order to claim victory at his word. Byleth was one of the youngest members of the group, but she was also one of the strongest, and she had been a major key to their triumph that night. That must have been what happened then. They had fought overnight, and once the battle was over, Byleth had been tired. This world didn't feel at all like the reality Byleth was used to. It was certainly real, yes, but it wasn't her world either. Between the emerald fog and the girl who was just barely unfamiliar to Byleth, the mercenary could only assume it was a dream of some kind. Byleth had been involved with many nighttime fights over the years as part of her work, but it never seemed to get any easier for her to push herself to alter her sleep schedule to fit the new mission. It seemed this dream was proof of another nighttime battle she had lost, though Byleth much preferred that she sleep rather than find herself caught up in the storm of combat at the wrong moment. "I believe we're asleep," Byleth said, only realizing what she had said after the words left her lips. Her eyes went wide, and she stared up at Suthies in confusion. "We?" Byleth couldn't figure out for the life of her why she had said something like that. "I suppose so," Suthies murmured, not at all minding Byleth's slip of phrasing. "I wouldn't want to keep you from the rest of the world, you know then. It wouldn't be right of me to hog you all for myself." She sent Byleth a sideways smile, and the mercenary continued to stare up at her, shocked at just how casually the green-haired girl had gone along with her error. "You don't need to look at me that way. I believe this is to be the start of a lovely partnership between us. Partners in destiny, if you will." "Partners in what?" Byleth echoed, her confusion only mounting more as the moments passed by. "I believe we will be collaborating this way for quite some time, and that means we must adjust to living with one another," Suthies explained, once again skipping over the reason for Byleth's perplexed expression. "What are we if not partners in destiny? A pair to face the world as one." Byleth nodded distantly at that, unsure as to how she was meant to respond to that. Hell, she didn't know what she was supposed to think of any of this. If this all was just some dream, then it was certainly more complex than any other dreams she had ever had. Beyond that, it all felt so real, like this was an extension of her life the same way her reality was. Byleth had heard of magic existing and had seen people fight with it personally, but she hadn't ever imagined it could be distorted quite like this. Just to prove that this was real, Byleth forced herself to raise one hand and brush her fingers against the stone of the throne. It was shockingly smooth beneath her hand, a perfect texture that Byleth would only find in a place like this. She turned her attention up to Suthies once again and saw that the girl was pushing herself to her full height. Even though she was only about 3/5 of Byleth's height, everything about her remained imposing as she descended the steps on the throne. Suthies stopped when she was even with Byleth's eye level, though she remained just a little bit higher than the mercenary just to maintain her constant aura of superiority. She extended one hand in Byleth's direction, a smile on her face. "To the first step as partners," she said. Her voice was casual and personable, but at the same time, Byleth knew she didn't have much of a choice in the matter. The mercenary pulled her hand away from the throne slowly and carefully before reaching out and taking Suthies' fingers between her own. Light began to creep in from around Byleth, white and blinding before it faded out to green. The mercenary pressed her eyes closed, desperate to escape the overwhelming glow before it could disorient her entirely. She could have sworn she felt a breeze run through her hair, the emerald fog crawling at her legs all the while. The world pinched and distorted, like Byleth was being pulled out by the back of her head. And when she awoke, she was back in the inn. The noble that had hired the mercenaries had been kind enough to offer them lodgings as part of Geralt's expensive fees, and Byleth was glad for it. She had spent far too much time over the last few weeks sleeping on the ground in a tent, and while she didn't mind that, she certainly preferred a bed. If only she had that luxury on a regular basis. On top of that, if Byleth was going to wake up from a dream that jarring anywhere, Byleth was glad it was an in-room where she knew she was safe. The door to the room opened, and Geralt walked in with a small smile on his face. "You did good tonight, kid," he greeted, rustling Byleth's hair. She offered him a tiny grin, though it wasn't much in terms of emotional displays. Then again, when it came to Byleth, no emotion was ever broadcast too loudly. Byleth nodded, though the action was muffled by the pillow beneath her head. "Thanks," she said softly. She wished she could have said something more, to explain just what had happened with Suthies, but she couldn't bring herself to speak up. It was odd, but she knew this was something to keep to herself. Geralt seemed to know there was something more to it though, and he sat down on the bed across the room while eyeing her carefully. "You okay, kid?" he asked carefully. Geralt wasn't a particularly emotional person either, something just about anyone could figure out after a single conversation with him. Byleth was happy that way though. They had their own ways of expressing themselves with each other, and that was all that mattered. "I'm fine," Byleth answered. "I just had an odd dream." "It's nothing." Her eyes were droopy all of a sudden, and Byleth couldn't help wondering if perhaps she should try to get more rest. There was no guarantee that she was going to see Suthies again when she closed her eyes, and Byleth couldn't tell if she should hope for that or not. On one hand, she wanted to know more about the strange girl of green, but on the other, Byleth didn't think she had actually gotten any value of sleep during their conversation. It was like she had just woken up in a different way even if she was technically asleep. "You should get some more rest then. We're leaving in the afternoon tomorrow," Geralt told her. "We're getting our pay tomorrow, and that should be all we need to take care of around here. We'll be out of here soon enough. Until then, enjoy the bed while we've got it. Who knows when we're going to get this chance again." Byleth nodded once again. She normally would have offered him a light snort of laughter, or at least whatever excuse she had in place of laughter, but she couldn't bring herself to bother. She was too distracted between her creeping exhaustion and the strange nature of her conversation with Suthies. Part of Byleth wanted to explain it to Geralt, but the sensation in the pit of her stomach that told her it wouldn't end well was enough to keep her quiet. Besides, how was she even supposed to tell him about all of this? "He wouldn't be able to hear me even if you did explain it. You are the only one I can contact." Byleth's eyes would have shot open in shock if not for her exhaustion. Instead, she pressed her eyelids closed and let Suthi's voice fill her ears. Byleth wouldn't be able to get away with talking to Suthies now, not with her father in the room and keeping a careful eye on her. She just hoped Suthies was able to understand what she wanted to get across in the silence. "Of course I understand," Suthies said with what Byleth could only assume was an exasperated roll of her eyes. "We share everything now. Such is the nature of being partners in destiny. I can hear your thoughts, and you can hear me. That is just the beginning of our relationship, but for now, it shall suffice." Byleth nodded gently, but Suthies seemed to be able to tell that the mercenary wasn't listening to her as much as she would have liked. "Rest for now. We can discuss this more another time. I can feel." Suthies paused to yawn, and Byleth could see the sleep-infused gesture in her mind's eye. "I can feel myself drifting off as well. We can begin again come morning. Until then. Good night, Byleth." The mercenary hummed softly, hoping her father didn't ask any questions from where he waited across the room. She would be able to ask more questions about this another time, but for the moment, she knew Suthies was meant to be there. One way or another, they were bound as one. That was what it meant to be partners in destiny. Chapter 3, Whims of Chance. "Did you really have to do this?" Shay sighed and rolled her eyes as she took another step forward, pushing Arvel's voice to the back of her mind. They had been going back and forth like this for at least the last hour, and it was starting to get obnoxious. "We're getting closer to Remire now," Shay replied. "We'll be there before you know it, and everything will come together like we've planned." "You say that," Arvel began with a snort and a roll of their eyes. "We've been wandering around for ages now, and you still don't know where you're going. I swear, there's not a single person in all of Fodlan with a worse sense of direction than you." "As if you've met any other people in Fodlan," Shay countered, and Arvel once again groaned. "It'll be fine. We're close, and we're going to get there before you know it," Remire is around here somewhere, and when we get there, everything is going to come together. No more Ashen Demon, no more worries, no more getting lost. Yes, I certainly hope this is the end of your bad habit of losing yourself, Arvel retorted with a hefty sigh. Also, you saying that Remire is around here somewhere hardly inspires any confidence in me. If anyone in this world is prone to getting lost, it would be you, and you barely seem to care about it at all. Of course I care. We're going to end all of this tonight, and afterward, we can. I don't know. Find some other missions to take on, Shay said. It's going to be fine. Arvel gave up on arguing and rolled their eyes dramatically one more time before falling silent. 6 months had come and gone since Shay's first encounter with the Ashen Demon. In the time since then, she had continued to set her sights only on the path ahead, only on the path that would lead to her enemy's death. Shay had been trying to get stronger in every way she possibly could in anticipation for this day, while also trying to keep an ear out for information about where Geralt's mercenaries were headed next. As it turned out, it was much harder than it should have been to figure out where they were at any given moment. The group was impressively good when it came to secrecy, always seeming to appear and fade away before anyone could calculate what was happening. It was as impressive as it was irritating, and Shay could only hope she was right with her assumptions about where they were tonight. The rumors said that the mercenaries were set to be in Remire village within Adrestian territory that night. They were trying to take care of a group of bandits that had been harassing the area over the course of the last few weeks, and this was the night they were set to strike. Shay was hoping to find them and confront the Ashen Demon after the fact. She was tired of standing around and waiting for something to happen that might point her in the right direction, so she was taking matters into her own hands. Of course, that meant she was going to have to actually find Remire, and that was much easier said than done. Shay had always suffered from a poor sense of direction, but she had never bothered to improve the skill as long as she was traveling with others. Getz had quickly joked with her that her sense of direction was a helpless effort that would never get better, and just like that, Shay had discarded any ideas of improvement. The rest of Berling's team had been able to guide her onward, and even before that, other mercenary groups had been able to help her too. Now though, Shay was cursing herself for not trying to fix this issue before it could blow up in her face. She had been wandering around for so long that she was starting to lose track of what direction was up and which way was down. Her map reading skills were terrible, and she had eventually given up on even looking at the paper at all. Shay had just crumpled it up and shoved it into her pocket in favor of following her instincts. It was a shame her instincts couldn't help her at all at this point. She was looking for something much better, like a person who could point her in the right direction. But how could she find someone like that when she was wandering in the woods at least 2 hours after the sun had gone down? This was hopeless. Arvel certainly seemed to agree, and Shay couldn't help wishing that whenever they had started to share their body with an otherworldly spirit, they had at least brought some damn navigation skills along for the ride. Instead, Arvel just seemed to enjoy picking on Shay for their shortcomings. In some ways, it was charming, but in other ways, it just annoyed Shay to no end. It could have been worse, but she still wished Arvel had a solution to all of this. That would certainly make things a hell of a lot easier. Arvel was primarily a boon in combat, something Shay had learned incredibly well over the course of the last few months of training together, but when it came to just about everything else, well, Shay was on her own there. Before Shay could try and spark up a new conversation with Arvel that wouldn't end with them bickering about their lack of navigational skills, the leaves nearby began to rustle. Shay perked up, and her shoulders went stiff. Arvel sighed in irritation. Great. Maybe that will be another wild monster here to test your skills. How many times have you tried to fight against a pack of beasts now? At least 5. Shay was on the verge of telling Arvel to knock it off, but she was cut off when the bushes nearby parted to show 3 figures walking through the darkness. That was no pack of monsters, it was people. 3 humans, creatures who would be able to point Shay in the right direction. She thanked the goddess for her blessings before realizing that the 3 were all holding weapons. There weren't any chances of Shay feeling comforted or safe. Stop plowing ahead, Claude. You're going to get us lost, came the voice of one of the 3. He was a young man who, in Shay's opinion, was much taller than anyone that young had a right to be. His hair was blonde, and he gripped tightly at a lance that again felt like it was much too large for someone like him. "We've got it on imperial authority that this is the way to the village," another young man's voice reminded the first. His hair was dark and curly, and he had a bow in one hand and arrow in the other. He twirled the arrow in an effortless, swift motion, all too casual for the sudden tension in the air. "I said there was a village near here. I never said that wandering around aimlessly would get us there any sooner," the final figure of the three cut in. She was the only girl of the group, and her hair fell against her back in a thick curtain of white. "The mountains and trees have made it much harder to ascertain where we are. Then I'll rely on my keen senses to navigate for us," the second boy declared, a mischievous smirk spreading across his features. "Lucky for you two, they're as sharp as an arrow." The first young man pushed one arm out in front of the other two, and they all went still. His eyes wandered in Shay's direction, glaring at the shadows even if he couldn't make out the details of the mercenary's face. "Someone else is here," he declared. "Another bandit, I presume." Arvel let out a noise that was somewhere between an aghast gasp and an offended scoff. "They're mistaking you for some common backwater thief." "What cheek!" they announced angrily. When Shay took a few steps forward at those words, it felt more like Arvel was making her move than anything else, their frustration boiling over. "Hold on. I'm not a bandit. I'm a mercenary," Shay explained hastily as her words started to catch up with her actions. She and Arvel still needed some practice in making things work in their shared body and mind, and this felt like another brutal reminder of that. The boy with the bow whirled the arrow one more time with a whistle. "Well, that makes everything better," he muttered, clearly not buying the excuse. "A bandit would be far less out of place in these woods than a sellsword," the girl remarked, eyeing up Shay from head to toe. Somehow, Shay felt like the girl was trying to stare straight through her to some unknown truth, and it was enough to make the mercenary want the ground to swallow her up. "What brings you here?" The blonde boy with the lance looked over his shoulder nervously. "We've no time for an interrogation. Our pursuers are closing in," he told his companions. Shay shook her head, holding up her hands in surrender so they could see she was harmless. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I think the introductions and talk can wait," Shay started. "You seem like you need every bit of help you can find. I know how to fight, and my pockets have been feeling awfully light lately. What do you say?" The three youths looked to one another uncertainly before nodding, clearly realizing they didn't have much of a choice in the matter. If they were going to get out of this in one piece, Shay was their only option. "All right," the blonde boy told her. "We can discuss matters of payment and recompense later. For now, please help us in any way you can." Shay reached for her sword with a smile, spinning the hilt over in her hand once before her grip tightened. "You don't need to tell me twice." As it turned out, Shay had picked up on much more than she thought while she was wandering through the woods. She had no idea which direction she was meant to be headed in order to arrive in Remire, but tracking bandits was significantly easier. She had taken up a position between the enemies and her new employers, sword at the ready. The bandits were hiding under the cover of night, but that still wasn't enough to keep them safe from Shay. When the first fighter sprang forward, his axe at the ready, Shay was prepared. She threw up her blade to defend from the strike before kicking at his stomach. The man tumbled backward, one hand grasping fitfully at his torso, and Shay followed up with a grand slash that forced him to the ground. This time, his hand fell still, and the rest of his body was quick to follow. Once again, the boy with the bow whistled, clearly impressed if the smile on his face was anything to go by. "You've got skill, Merc. I'll give you that much," he praised before he knocked an arrow on his bow. When the arrow flew free, Shay noticed the air around him start to glow as a symbol manifested in the shadows, briefly offering a flicker of illumination on the dark night. For a long moment, all Shay could do was stare, unable to believe what she was seeing. "A crest!" Arvel exclaimed. It had been a long time since Shay had seen a crest activate. For the most part, those were only found in the nobility, and it wasn't exactly likely for a mercenary to run into someone with such a valuable bloodline while going about their regular life. With that in mind, what in the world was someone with a crest doing wandering through the woods like this? The boy with the bow knocked an arrow, and just as quickly as the crest had appeared, it was gone. Shay watched him out of the corner of her eye for a few more moments, trying to test if the crest would appear again, but she saw nothing. Eventually, she decided her attention was better spent on the fight itself, and with that, Shay turned her focus back to the nearest bandit. She barely even needed to try to cleave straight through him, forcing the man onto the ground with his axe abandoned in the grass, never to be used again. A sword fighter came out of the shadows next, and luckily, the blonde boy threw his lance up just in time to block the attack. He effortlessly twisted the weapon around to send the blade into the ground below, sticking out of the dirt. For how lanky he appeared at a first glance, the blonde had impressive muscles, if the sword in the grass was anything to go off. From there, the boy stabbed forward, and the mercenary let out a groan of pain before falling into the ground near his blade. "My apologies," the blonde whispered. "But it was either you or me." He looked down at the fallen mercenary, sorrow in his eyes, before he looked up just in time to catch another mercenary charging at him. This time, he went on the offensive first, and the air around him gleamed with the promise of yet another crest before he stabbed forward. That single hit was all it took to eliminate the mercenary, and this time, the man didn't even have time to let out a final noise of agony before the life left his body. This time, Arvel didn't have the chance to say anything about the blonde having a crest, but Shay heard them let out a small noise of interest. They were already trying to calculate just how much they would be able to get out of this strange trio of characters. Something in the back of Shay's mind told her that she was going to be paid handsomely for this job. The white-haired girl raised her axe high, and Shay briefly wondered how someone so small could handle a blade that regularly involved greater strength than other weapon types. Still, the girl had no issues with swinging the axe down straight across the chest of one of her enemies. Before the man could recover, she followed up with a second attack, and just like that, the bandit fell to the ground. The girl scanned the immediate area for a few seconds before nodding to herself. "There are no other bandits around here. We should press forward and cut through the rest of them. If we don't go on the offensive first, they will no doubt pursue us well into the night," she declared. She gestured for the rest of the group to follow her, though she stopped when a bandit came up in front of her again. With another glow in the air and a matching slash of her axe, the girl cut the man across the chest, and she was right back to walking again a moment later, almost as if nothing had happened at all. "Just who are these three? All of them have crests," Arvel exclaimed, their shock and suspicion equally notable in their voice. "Stay close. They must have something of value for us, and I can only imagine they can solve any problems we could ever have when it comes to keeping ourselves fed." As the quartet moved through the trees, the area started to open itself up considerably, and Shay was beyond thankful for that. The moonlight shone brighter between the leaves overhead, and that was all the illumination Shay needed to start plowing through the rest of the bandits. The trio of crest bearers followed her through the woods, though Shay was the one who took the lead. She had the most combat experience, though the others must have known quite a bit to be able to even come close to keeping up with her. Their weapons were expensive and durable, yet another point in their directions. Once again, Shay was left to wonder just how a strange group like this had wound up in the woods. If anything, they were much more out of place than a mercenary like her, even if they didn't want to admit it. Eventually, a face made itself clear in the darkness, and Shay could tell by the way the man carried himself that he was the leader of the group. His hair was brown and left long, a ponytail tied at the base of his neck. Everything about him was hardened by years of battle experience, but he still swung his blade clumsily. He was used to easy marks, but Shay was determined to be anything but for the duration of the battle. "There they are. Tear 'em all to pieces," the man exclaimed as he pointed ahead at the group. One of the other bandits saluted to him, and Shay heard the commander's name in the midst of the chaos. He was called Costas. Shay decided the detail didn't matter much, instead pushing forward to defeat the man then and there. Costas was too smart for that though, and he made to retreat as soon as he realized that Shay was bearing down on him. She knew where he was headed without needing to ask. She had spotted a small worn fortress in the woods on the way here, and he was probably heading back to the stronghold to give himself at least a little bit of space to hole up in should all of this go south. That was fine with Shay though. The fortress wasn't far away, and she would be able to push her way through and defeat him in a matter of minutes. The entire battlefield would be cleaned out by the time the hour was over. Suddenly, A scream tore through the air, and Shay perked up before looking around at the other three in the area. The sound certainly hadn't come from her three new employers, and if anything, they looked just as shocked as she did. They hadn't struck down any bandit to cause a shout like that. In fact, it sounded as if the voice had come from some other part of the forest beyond the fortress that Costas had claimed for himself. Were there other bandits on the other side of the area? What in the world could have happened for them to scream that way? The Knights of Syros have arrived. Came a voice in the distance, and Shay's ears perked up. The Knights of Syros? What in the world would they be doing here of all places? She had seen a few run-ins with the knights over the years, but this felt different somehow. Shay whirled her blade before striking at another of the nearby bandits, determined to finish things off as soon as possible so she could hear the answers she sought about the Knights of Syros. I guess they finally noticed what was happening, huh? The boy with the bow muttered. About time. I was starting to think they weren't going to catch up with us until the sun came up. He let out a loose snort of satisfaction with his own joke before he released another arrow into a bandit, offering the perfect distraction for his other allies to finish off the man. Now that we have backup, we can rush their position, the girl announced. I doubt that commander of theirs Costas, I believe they said his name was, will be able to withstand an assault from two sides. She heaved her axe up over her shoulder before she took off running, and once again, Shay was left to wonder just how someone so small could handle an axe so effortlessly. Understood. Onward, everyone. The blonde boy declared. He took off after the girl a moment later, and Shay watched him go before she followed up and trailed his path. I think this is the perfect time to push your limits a bit more, Arvel said, a smirk playing at their lips. You haven't had the chance to use that power of yours in a while, and these seem like the sort of people you would want to impress. Wouldn't you agree? Shay nodded. She wasn't the type to go along with being a showboat most of the time, but she agreed that with how important these strange teens appeared to be, this was the perfect time for her to put her power on full display. She closed her eyes and let the energy of combat rush through her, dyeing her hair orange, pink, and red along with her regular purple. Her eyes followed the same fading pattern, and she followed her blade forward as a second sword of molten lava appeared in her grip. She was still working on summoning the blade more regularly, but when she let her strength take full control of her, it always seemed to come naturally. Besides, if she was going to take on the boss behind this bandit group, she was going to need all the power she could get her hands on. Shay's determination brought with it a burst of speed that let her beat the white-haired girl to the fortress Costas was currently calling his own, and the mercenary smiled to herself as she rushed toward him. He was rough around the edges but still prepared for the onslaught, his eyes narrowing into a glare. I ain't done yet. You're gonna learn how tough a bandit can really be. He cried. Shay slashed at him with both her blades, and Costas stumbled backward immediately. How are you? He began, but he never got the chance to finish the sentence before Shay was on the offensive once again. She pushed him to the ground and struck one final time. Costas' eyes went wide, and he glared up at Shay as he pushed a few more limp words from his lips. NGH. Never shoulda taken this job. Shay let her swords fall to her side, and her molten blade disappeared in a light puff of smoke along with the dye of her hair. She turned to the trio of teens behind her, curiosity and wariness written across her features. Is it over? She asked. The blonde boy glanced around the area once again before nodding, and he let the tip of his lance fall downward. It seems to be, he murmured. He looked back to Shay, a relieved smile on his face. We owe you our thanks. I doubt we would have been able to triumph over them without your help. It's no problem, Shay assured him with a wave of her free hand. I'm glad I was able to help out. Now that we've gotten rid of those guys, I guess we have time for some actual introductions, huh? I feel like we should have done that sooner, especially if you have the Knights of Syros on your side. I'm surprised you haven't heard already, the boy with the bow remarked, and Shay tilted her head to the side in confusion. I'm Claude von Regan, heir to the Leicester Alliance. Shay felt her stomach drop into her feet as she realized just how casual she had been with the heir of an entire country. Her home country, no less. Her eyes went wide, and she wished the earth would swallow her up as the boy with the lance bowed his head. I am Dmitri Alexander Bladdid, Crown Prince of the Holy Kingdom of Faerghus, he went on. Just when Shay thought this couldn't get any worse, the girl with white hair offered her a kind smile. And I am Edelgard von Hresvelg, Imperial Princess of the Adrestian Empire. Shay swallowed dryly, wishing she had some witty comeback to make up for the terribly improper way she had been behaving previously. You cannot be serious, was all she ended up able to squeak out, and she could have sworn she heard Arvel groan louder than they ever had before. She wasn't doing a great job with the whole idea of having the heirs to the world in her debt, was she? We most certainly are, Edelgard replied, her smile not wavering in the slightest. We owe you a great debt for all you did for us here tonight. Thank you for your help. She paused, waiting for Shay to fill in her name. Shay, the mercenary replied. And I'm glad I was able to help. Though I didn't really think my night would end with me helping the heirs to the entire continent. I guess that's what I get for wandering around in the woods, right? She laughed nervously, and much to her surprise, all three of the teens before her smiled gently in response. Maybe she didn't have as much to worry about as she would have thought. Speaking of wandering around in the woods, just what were you doing here in the first place? Claude asked, raising an eyebrow in Shay's direction. I don't think you're going to find much mercenary work out here unless you keep running into nobles escaping trouble. I was looking for Remire village, Shay replied, the tension in her shoulders finally starting to dissipate. I was hoping to see a band of mercenaries led by a man named Geralt there, but I got lost along the way. Remire is the village we were looking for when we ran into you, as a matter of fact, Dimitri told her. We haven't had much success in tracking it, though I suppose we don't need the help anymore. We were hoping to ask the village's occupants for help in fending off the bandits since we were closer to Remire than our camp. Camp? Shay echoed. There were other people around here? As soon as the thought passed through her head, Shay kicked herself for not thinking about that sooner. Of course nobody would even dare to leave the three heirs to the three countries of Fodlan on their own in the woods. The Knights of Syros had probably come from that camp to bail the three out of trouble only to end up at the tail end of the fight instead of doing much to help from the front end. Everything made so much sense all of a sudden, and Shay felt her stomach do a flip at her own lack of foresight. There you are. The boisterous voice from before the one that had called out that the Knights of Syros had arrived rang through the air before Shay could get a grip on her bearings again. A man appeared from the darkness, his white and gold armor making it easy to distinguish him from the surrounding trees and shadows. He had a bright smile on his face despite the circumstances of the recent bandit attack. I was starting to worry for you three, he began as he looked over the trio of heirs. He turned his attention to Shay a moment later. And who might you be? I don't believe we've met. My name is Shay, the mercenary replied. I'm a mercenary, and I was helping these three out with their little bandit problem. So you're the person I have to thank for keeping them out of trouble. The man grinned. My name is Eloise, and I'm a member of the Knights of Syros. I insist that you come with us back to camp to receive payment. And so that we may ask you a few questions. Shay went tense instinctively, and Arvel's words a moment later told her that they had been responsible for the motion. I don't like this. Just collect your pay and go, they hissed. We're going to miss Geralt and the Ashen Demon if we let them stall us for too much longer. Shay opened her mouth to retort, but Eloise held up a hand to stop her. I lack the compensation to pay you for your services now, but if you come with us back to camp, I can make sure you receive all you deserve for your work tonight, he went on. We can wait out the night together and make for Remire in the morning if you still want to go, Claude offered. It's the least we can do after you helped us out back there. I doubt you would be able to make much progress toward the village in this darkness anyway, Dimitri supplied. We would be happy to supply you with a place to rest for the night if you need it. I would like to speak with you for a moment back at the camp as well, Edelgard went on. Geralt's band can wait until morning, if it's all right with you. Shay looked back and forth between all four of them, already knowing this wasn't going to be as easy as she would have liked. Still, there was a part of her that wanted to go with them. She had spent 6 months tracking Geralt's company, yes, but meeting with the heirs of the continent was even rarer than finding the Ashen Demon again. She had to take advantage of this chance while she had it. All right, Shay agreed with a nod. I'll come with you. She couldn't tell if she was more upset about missing Geralt or excited to see where this led her, but she ultimately decided she could think about that another time. For the moment, she had more important things on her mind, like going to see what this group had in store for her. Alois nodded. "You said you were looking for a man named Geralt, yes?" he asked. Shay nodded, and Alois hummed to himself. 1,001 emotions passed through his features in the moments that followed, but he did his best to hide it. "I see. I'll have to join you when you go to speak with him in the morning. In the meantime, let's return to camp." Arvel sighed heavily from their place in the back of Shay's mind. Just what have we gotten into? Chapter 4, Shift from Inevitability. As it turned out, navigating the woods was much simpler when there was someone present who knew what they were doing. Alois didn't seem to have any issues at all with navigating through the trees, and even as he let out a string of absolutely terrible jokes to try and ease the heavy atmosphere, he saw no troubles with leading Shay and the heirs of Fodlan back to their camp. Arvel seemed to find it an insult that the knight was better at using a map than Shay, but the mercenary opted to not care about it. She had more important things on her mind at the moment, and the first of them was figuring out just why Alois had wanted her to come back to the camp in the first place. Shay wasn't a huge fan of politics, and she didn't get involved with them when it could be avoided. At the same time, she knew when something was wrong, and Alois had to be making all those awful jokes to cover it up. It wasn't for the sake of keeping everyone's spirits high when no one seemed particularly upset by what had happened in the first place. He was hiding something, and Shay was sure the truth was going to find its way out soon enough. The camp was much larger than Shay initially expected, and her eyes went wide as she looked around. It wasn't a small expedition at all. Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude had wandered away from the group while the rest of them had all opted to stay near the camp. The three immediately went their separate ways as others their age came over to fuss about their disappearance. All of the newcomers wore the same black, navy blue, and gold uniform, and Shay couldn't help but be caught off guard by just how similar the clothing was. It had to be planned in advance, not that she could say for sure why. Shay didn't get the chance to go around asking questions either, instead turning to face Alois when he came up beside her. "Welcome to the camp for the Officers' Academy," he began, gesturing out to the rest of the area. "The Officers' Academy?" Shay echoed. She had heard of it before, but she hadn't ever come close to seeing Gareg Mach with her own two eyes, so it had always just been a phantom in her peripheral vision. There she was despite it all though, helping to guide students from the school back to their camp. No wonder everyone looked so similar. They were students of the Officers' Academy who had already gotten into their uniforms for the upcoming school year. Alois nodded. "The three young people you assisted earlier are the heads of the Academy's 3 houses. They were meant to stay around this area, but they went off together with another professor about 2 hours ago to collect supplies and never returned. The bandits stopped them from returning. It was quite the battle to keep the rest of the students calm as long as the house leaders were missing," he went on, letting out a small laugh to once again hide something. He was hoping Shay wouldn't notice, but it was already too late for that. "You can go around and speak with all the students if you'd like. I need to speak with a few of the other knights chaperoning the trip, and you can take this chance to bond with the 3 you rescued. I'm sure they'd like to talk to you for a while longer. I can't hog you forever, after all." Alois patted one hand against Shay's back and she agreed inwardly that she wasn't going to be able to talk to him forever. Edelgard had said she wanted to talk, right? Shay might as well go and take care of that. She could see if Dimitri and Claude had anything to say along the way too. She trained her gaze on the white-haired princess first and found her speaking softly with a taller student with black hair. The other student watched Shay with piercing eyes that bordered on being gold before he walked away, leaving Edelgard alone with the mercenary. Shay did her best to hide her anxiety and unease at the sight of him, and she shoved aside the thought that he was watching her long after he walked away. For a princess, Edelgard certainly kept strange company. Edelgard herself didn't seem to mind the other student at all though, instead smiling kindly to Shay. "Thank you for your assistance in the previous battle, Shay," Edelgard started. "I'd like to discuss your future, if you have a moment." That was more than enough to catch Shay off guard, and her eyes went wide. "My future?" she repeated. Edelgard nodded. If you find yourself with no place to go after we accomplish our objective, I'm hoping we might hire you on with the Empire. You certainly have talent, and I can't let something like that go so easily. I can promise you'll be handsomely paid, including the work you did today, she went on, a light smile on her face. Everything about her was startlingly casual, even though what she was saying would change the course of Shay's life in ways she never could have imagined. Shay wondered quietly if Edelgard was always like that. She had to reply eventually though, so Shay allowed herself to smile around her shock. It was an amazing offer no matter what, and she was honored to hear it in the first place. I appreciate the offer, Shay began, though her curiosity started to gnaw at her a moment later. But I'm not usually hired by people quite so high up the food chain. You're the princess of an entire country, for goddess' sake. Why the special attention? I value your talent now that I've had the ability to see it firsthand, Edelgard answered simply. I'm always looking for talented, powerful people to join the Empire's forces, and you're hardly an exception. I'll certainly have to consider your offer then, Shay smiled. That would certainly be a departure from her regular mercenary work. Catching the eye of the future emperor was bound to fix her problems of not being able to put food on her plate now that she was working solo. Edelgard seemed nice on top of that, and who was Shay to refuse something so kind? Edelgard fell into silence for a few seconds before glancing around the rest of the area. Have you had the time to speak with the others in the camp? She asked, and Shay shook her head. Edelgard smiled kindly once again, and Shay couldn't help but feel strangely at home at the girl's side. In that case, allow me to tell you about the others in my house, the Black Eagles. With that, Edelgard told Shay everything there was to know about her house, and Shay hung on to every word. The student who had been speaking with Edelgard previously was named Hubert, and he was her retainer. That certainly explained the death glares Shay could still feel herself getting from him, though Edelgard didn't bring that up aside from a passing mention of him being intimidating. The rest of the students seemed much nicer based on Edelgard's descriptions. Ferdinand was dramatic but well-meaning. Dorothea was charming and had a history in music. Caspar was the fighter, Linhard his opposite, and Petra was the princess of Brigid. Bernadetta was the only person Edelgard couldn't point out since she had apparently declined to appear at the camping trip at all. Despite Edelgard listing off so many people in such rapid succession, Shay found that she had no issues telling them all apart. As a whole, the Black Eagles seemed kind to Shay. They were an interesting cast of characters together, and their desire to make the world around them a better place shone through clear as could be. Even if they were all different, they were united by a common purpose and a sense of charm Edelgard conveyed well through her words. They seemed like interesting people, and Shay wondered if she would get to know them better if she followed Edelgard up on her offer of working for the Empire. After bidding farewell to Edelgard, Shay set her sights on Dmitri. He was polishing his lance from the previous battle, but he set both his cloth and weapon aside when he noticed Shay. "Ah, Shay," he greeted kindly. "Allow me to express my utmost gratitude for all you did for us before. We are in your debt." "I did what anyone would," Shay replied with a smile. She found that talking to the house leaders was getting easier the more she did it, like the weight was slowly melting off her shoulders. She was beyond relieved for the break too. She was going to give herself a backache if she didn't start to calm down soon. "I examined a map when we returned to camp, and it appears the village you are headed toward is to the east from here," Dmitri went on. "Though I suppose it will be a bit longer before you'll be able to go there now. I hope you don't mind coming back here to camp too much." Shay shrugged. "It'll be fine," she said, even though a small part of her mind was beyond irritated that these two incidents had taken place so close together. Geralt's mercenaries had been damn near impossible to track over the course of the last half a year, and Shay cursed the universe for offering her the chance to strike on the same night she met with the house leaders. This was bound to change her life for the best, but it was still frustrating that she was at such a tragic crossroads. Arvel wasn't much happier with it than Shay. They let out a heavy sigh. "If we can get out of here soon, we might still be able to catch them," they pointed out. "Though I somehow doubt that's going to happen. Everyone is staring at you like they want to talk before the night is over." Shay looked over Dimitri's shoulder and saw that Arvel was right. Hubert was watching her again, albeit from a different position from before. A few other students were whispering to each other while looking over at Shay, trying and failing to look like they weren't talking about her. Shay was normally fine with being the center of attention, but this time, she couldn't help feeling like it was all wrong. She was surrounded by nobles and royals, and she was, at the very best, out of place compared to the rest of them. "While you're here, perhaps you should take the time to speak with the other students," Dmitri suggested, completely unaware of the depths of Shay's plight. "If you would like, I could tell you about them while I have you here." Shay nodded, glad to have that extra bit of introductory cushion before she moved to look around the rest of the camp. Dmitri led the Blue Lions, the house made up of students from the Holy Kingdom of Faergus. As was to be expected, a strong majority of them were nobles. The primary exception to that rule was Didu, Dmitri's vassal. He had kind eyes even as he watched Shay with light suspicion nearby. Dmitri described Felix as sharp, though based on the look in the swordsman's eyes, Shay couldn't help thinking that perhaps sharp was a kinder stand-in term for full of rage and hate. Sylvain was a man of passion, and his eyes followed Shay throughout her entire conversation with Dmitri. Annette and Mercedes were both kind and generous, always wearing some smile or another. Ingrid was hoping to become a knight as per the structure of the kingdom, and the same applied to Ash. The best way Shay could describe them was seeming a bit more formal than the Black Eagles, but not in the way she would have expected. In some ways, it seemed as if they regarded each other at arm's length at the absolute closest, with only the exception of Dmitri with Didu and Annette with Mercedes. They spent time together, but they never quite let anyone get too close. It was a working relationship as far as Shay could tell, albeit an incredibly strange one. Shay wound up leaving Dmitri behind a few moments later with a smile and a wave over her shoulder. The only one left for her to talk to was Claude, who wore his eternal smirk even though it never quite reached his eyes. "Hey, friend. I appreciate what you did back there. We would have been in a world of hurt without your help," Claude greeted. "I want to say though that I was told to not pay you personally. Alois said the church wants to handle it as an internal affair, and I don't want to get in the middle of that. It's no problem. As long as I'm getting paid, it's all with me," Shay replied with a loose wave of one hand. If she could get enough money to keep her fed for a little while longer, who was she to complain? "Hush money, if I had to guess," Arvel chimed in. "The church wants to keep all of this from getting out. I imagine they would have too much negative attention if they revealed that their students were attacked on a trip they chaperoned, especially if those students happened to include the future leaders of the continent." Shay couldn't bring herself to protest Arvel's words since they probably had a point. She didn't say anything out loud though due to Claude being right there. He didn't notice that she was distracted, instead just rolling right on with the conversation. "It shouldn't have been a problem like that in the first place," Claude continued. "There was another teacher who was supposed to be looking after us when we went out, but he's new to the officers' academy and doesn't have all that much combat experience. He ran off the instant the bandits showed up, and the knights still haven't found him. If I had to guess, I would say that they're both fired and never coming back." "That makes sense," Shay nodded to herself. "Sending the three of you off in the woods sounds like it's just inviting disaster, but if you were supposed to have someone else along for the ride, then hypothetically, that situation should have been avoided entirely, but I guess there's nothing we can do about it now," Claude shrugged. "You were there to bail us out, and I'm glad you were. We probably would have had to run all the way to Remire without you showing up when you did. I think it worked out well for all of us in the end," Shay smiled, not wanting to admit that she probably would have wound up wandering lost and aimless through the woods all night if not for the timely arrival of the house leaders. It also would have likely ended with yet another speech from Arvel about her lack of forethought, and there were only so many lectures Shay could take in one day. "As long as I have you here, I might as well tell you about everyone else around here," Claude said next. "It wouldn't hurt for you to know who the Golden Deer are. I mean, if you're going to be staying here for the rest of the night, you might as well know everyone's names, right?" This was the house Shay was probably the most curious about. Claude's Golden Deer were from Leicester, and Shay was as well. She didn't think of herself as having much national pride, but it was still nice to be around people from her home. After wandering in the Empire for so long, it was certainly a breath of fresh air. Claude didn't miss a beat in explaining everything Shay needed to know about them. Lawrence was an attentive noble, though it was up to Shay to decide if that was a good thing or not. Hilda was inclined toward laziness, the complete opposite of Leonie and Lysithea, albeit in different ways in both cases. Marianne was easily the shyest of the group, with Higgins coming second in that category. Raphael was easily the most talkative of the bunch, boisterous and friendly to everyone who crossed his path. They were a strange bunch to Shay, but she could tell that their dynamic was still a fun one too. The alliance was structured differently enough from the Empire and Kingdom that it stuck out to Shay, but she supposed that was to be expected of her home. She should have expected this, if anything. After the explanation of the others in the Golden Deer House was finished, Shay looked over in Alois' direction, trying to figure out if it was too soon for her to go back and ask him what the plan was from then on. She eventually decided on going to speak with him either way, and she caught a glimpse of two other people who stuck out against the crowd. She could only assume they were teachers given the fact that they weren't dressed in the knight's regular white attire. One of them was an older man with gray hair and a monocle over one eye. The other was a much younger woman who, as far as Shay could tell, had a flair for the dramatic. She could sense that without even getting close to the woman, and Shay ultimately decided that perhaps keeping her distance was best if she wanted to talk to Alois in a timely manner. In the end, Shay found Alois near the entrance of the camp. It appeared that he had just finished speaking with a few other members of the Knights of Syros, and his conversation partners were walking away from the area. He watched them quietly before perking up at the sight of Shay. "Ah, Shay. Just the mercenary I was hoping to see," Alois started, plastering a smile on his face that told Shay she was about to be in a world of trouble. "What is it?" Shay asked with a frown. She didn't like how he already seemed to be trying to avoid the subject of her pay. It left an awful feeling in the pit of her stomach, and as far as she could tell, Arvel felt the same way. Their impatience to go and find the Ashen demon was no secret, and even when presented with the house leaders and future rulers of the continent, Arvel wanted to move on and continue tracking Geralt's party. Once again, Shay cursed the universe for putting her in the worst possible position that night. "My sincerest apologies for asking this of you, but would you be alright with accompanying us back to Gareg Mach Monastery?" Alois questioned. Shay's eyes went wide. "The church lacks the funds in the camp to properly reward you for your great service. At the monastery, however, we can repay your kindness in full." Shay continued to stare at him, wishing she could find a way to make all of this work, but she could already tell it wasn't going to be quite so simple. The sheepish expression that worked itself across Alois' face a moment later made her wince. "Between you and me, this evening's turn of events was quite the embarrassment for the church. The future leaders of Fodlan crossed swords with bandits. If word got out, well, let's just say it would sit poorly with everyone, so you can see why we must ensure you are well compensated." "Hush money," Arvel concluded, the words dripping off their lips in a heavy frown. "They're trying to keep us quiet for the sake of keeping their reputation intact. I somehow get the feeling this doesn't have as much to do with the reward as you would like to admit," Shay said instead, for the sake of not upsetting Alois. She didn't know what he was trying to get at in full, but she didn't want to irritate him either, not when she was surrounded by countless other powerful fighters who would definitely be willing to attack if he gave the word. "I'd just as soon send you on your way if that's what you wanted, but I fear I am obligated to escort you back. The whole thing will be much easier for all of us if you come along." "Just as a formality, of course," Alois replied, offering that last bit as a tacked-on conclusion with a smile Shay couldn't quite read. "I think that was a threat." "Who would have thought he had it in him?" Arvel asked, almost impressed with Alois' change of heart. "Gareg Mach is in the opposite direction of where we need to be, but I don't know if we're going to have a choice at this point. What do you think?" Shay wished she had an easy answer to that question, but the fact of the matter was that she had no idea what she was supposed to think of all this. This could have been the greatest chance of her life, and even if she wanted to go on and track down the Ashen demon while she knew where she was, Shay could tell that wasn't going to be an option. Alois wasn't going to just let her go that easily, and she knew it well. Beyond that, she had been offered a chance to work steadily in the Empire for the rest of her life thanks to Edelgard. Surely Edelgard would be able to help her out at least in some way, right? And that didn't even factor in the reward money from the church. Even if it was hush money as Arvel had rightfully concluded, it would help, and who was Shay to turn that down? All right, Shay eventually said, the word coming out thicker and heavier than she had expected. If you want me to come with you that badly, we've got a deal. Perfect. In that case, I'll round up the rest of the students and tell thee it's time for us to go back, Alois announced with a smile. He started back toward the heart of the camp, and Shay watched him go, sighing once she was sure he was out of earshot. This was far from how she had expected the day to go, but she supposed it would be fine. It would all work out eventually, she was sure, for better or worse. I guess tracking the Ashen demon is going to have to wait, Arvel hummed. But this is a great opportunity in other ways. Getting in good with the most important teenagers in all of Fodlan is bound to pay us back handsomely. Who would have thought that getting lost in the woods would be all it took to change everything? Shay remarked with a humored laugh. I suppose that's going to teach me to underestimate my poor navigation skills in the future. I mean, they might have just given me a fortune on a silver platter. I doubt you can count on this happening again the next time you get lost, Arvel pointed out. I would advise that you be a bit more careful in the future to make sure you don't stumble into the bad end of someone's blade instead. Dmitri looked like he wanted to skewer you for a moment there. Shay cringed at the painful truth in Arvel's words but brushed it off when Alois returned with the three house leaders hot on his heels. Edelgard was the first to speak up, the same pleasant smile as always pressed across her features. We heard you'll be accompanying us back to Gareg Mach, she began. I know this wasn't in your plans, but if it lets us get to know each other better, perhaps it will prove worth it in the end. Alois' expression changed for a flicker of a moment to tell everyone that this had been an involuntary exchange, and while he corrected himself quickly, he didn't backpedal fast enough to keep the students from noticing. Unwilling or not, we've got a long road ahead, so let's try to keep the mood light, Claude interjected. I doubt anyone's going to want to wait until the morning to travel back, even if it might be a better idea to keep us out of the hands of bandits. No one in the camp has slept all night because of everything that happened earlier. Perhaps sleeping in our own beds back at the officers' academy will help to take the weight off a little bit, Dmitri chimed in. I have no doubt we could spare an extra room for you tonight, Shay. I think you've more than earned it after all you did for us earlier. We'll all make sure this was worth your time, Claude assured Shay with his same old smile. Even now, the grin didn't quite reach his eyes, and Shay couldn't help but wonder just what was going through his head that he wasn't revealing openly. I'm sure you will, Shay smiled in return. She couldn't even tell herself what tone the words were meant to have, and she ultimately decided it didn't matter, not as long as she had more important things to focus on. Right now, that included getting back to the monastery and figuring out what that was going to mean for her future. Claude let out a small chuckle that Shay once again couldn't read, and Alois cut through the conversation by clearing his throat. The rest of the students and knights have finished packing up the camp now, and I believe that's our cue to head back to the monastery, he declared. We have a few hours until the sun rises, and we march for all of them. Forward, everyone. With that, the crowd of students started to shuffle through the darkness in the direction that Shay could only hope would lead her to the officers' academy and the rest of Gareg Mach Monastery. Shay focused primarily on placing one foot in front of the other, doing her best to ignore the way the students behind her were chattering. She didn't mind them keeping an eye on her after everything that had happened, of course, but it still felt strange for so many people to be watching her with so much curiosity all of a sudden. Shay could only hope she either got used to it soon or it stopped before she could feel the pressure any longer than she already had. Luckily, Arvel was there to provide the distraction she needed. You know you've had busy day when you rub shoulders with the heirs to the Empire, the Kingdom, and the Alliance. I think they're a fascinating group of people, myself, but what do you make of them? Shay thought about it for a moment before thinking her answers to Arvel's question, not wanting to attract any attention by speaking out loud. Edelgard seemed to think highly of Shay so far, and the princess had an elegant air that the mercenary could certainly appreciate. Even with that aura of politeness and practiced prestige, Edelgard still felt relatable, and in a camp filled to the brim with nobles, that's something Shay could appreciate. Dmitri seemed kind, and his eyes told a story of someone who cared greatly for those around him. His care for the Blue Lions was clear even if they all had a habit of holding one another at arm's length. That love was bound to make him a fine king when he took to the throne, and his skills with the lance would no doubt make up the rest of the space he needed as a ruler. Lastly, there was Claude. His laid-back, relaxed attitude contrasted sharply with the constant regality of Edelgard and Dimitri, and if Shay was being honest, he barely felt like a noble at all. He was cooperative and open, at least to a degree. She couldn't help wondering what was really going through his head, but given the way he had behaved previously, Shay had no reason to doubt him or his actions. "Of course you only pick up on their rosy qualities," Arvel remarked. "I'm certain all of them have something to hide due to their positions as nobles. Every royal is bound to have a few skeletons in the closet. Edelgard's offer might be too good to be true. Dimitri's kindness could come back to bite him if he can't assert himself enough as a ruler. Claude is hiding something from all of us, and he doesn't seem to regret it either." She nodded at that, but she once again said nothing aloud. Maybe Arvel was right. Still, she didn't think it was right to make a judgment of people before she had the chance to get to know them fully. She would have all the time in the world to talk to the house leaders in the future as far as she could tell. After all, she didn't know when she was going to be leaving the monastery, so she might as well get used to the chance while she had it. As Shay walked farther away from Remire, she wondered what would have happened if she had found the Ashen demon that night. She shook it off in the end though, knowing that musing on what could have been wasn't going to help her at all. She had to focus on what had happened, and that meant going back to the monastery to speak with the people there. She could track down the mercenaries again after she had found her way forward. She would never need to worry about money again if she got lucky, and that was still a win. In Remire village, the Ashen demon was undisturbed by an encounter that could have been hers in another life. Chapter 5, A Choice in Crimson. Shay quickly learned that Gareg Mach Monastery was every bit as grand as the rumors had claimed it to be. As soon as she arrived in the surrounding forests, she tilted her head up to stare at the monastery where it sat at the peak of a nearby mountain. It was like the entire continent was trying to cradle the monastery as if it was a child, and Shay could certainly see why it had earned such a strong reputation. She had heard much about the monastery, but seeing it in person was an entirely different experience, and it took much more energy than she would have expected for her to force herself to move forward instead of just stopping to stare for hours. The sun was just starting to creep over the horizon by the time Eloise and the rest of the Knights of Syros led the students and Shay back to the building. Everyone was exhausted after their night of marching, and they almost immediately dispersed for a few hours of rest. Eloise offered to let Shay sleep in one of the guest rooms while he explained the situation to the rest of the monastery officials, and Shay had gladly accepted the offer just to get off her feet. She wasn't used to pulling all-nighters like this, and she hoped she didn't have to do it again for quite some time. Shay collapsed gracelessly onto the bed, spreading her arms out wide to either side as she stared up at the ceiling. The monastery's guest beds were even nice, much fancier than anything Shay had seen in a long time. She was used to wandering from inn to inn, sleeping anywhere that she could if she wasn't on a bed of leaves in the middle of the woods. The monastery, on the other hand, certainly offered her the stability that she had spent so long searching for, and she more than welcomed it. Arvel seemed to agree if their heavy sigh of relief was any indication. "Oh, this is nice. I guess this is something we could get used to," they murmured. "Perhaps having to go along with that night was a better thing than we could have ever expected. Now that we're here, I can't believe this was ever a question at all." Shay resisted an offhand comment about how Arvel had been resisting coming back to the monastery much more than she ever had, instead just letting out a loose laugh. "Oh, you can say that again," Shay agreed. As soon as her eyes started to slip shut, she knew she wasn't going to last much longer in the land of the waking, and she was asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. When Shay next woke up, she was disoriented at best with a crick in her neck and next to no idea of what time it was. The sun was higher in the sky than it had been when she first arrived, and Shay rubbed at her eyes to keep from being temporarily blinded by the sight. She wandered over to the window and looked out over the mountains below, finding that the view was more than worth it. A slight breeze brushed through the area, and Shay smiled to herself before sitting down on her bed once again. Apparently, she had woken up with perfect timing, as a knock came at her door soon afterward. Before Shay could ask who it was, Eloise's voice spoke up from the other side. "Shay? Are you awake?" "Yeah," Shay replied as she shuffled over to the door and opened it. She stretched out her neck a little bit before letting out a small grounding breath. Do you need something from me? The Archbishop asked me to bring you to her. She wishes to speak with you about what happened last night, Eloise explained. Even though he was casual as could be, Shay felt her stomach drop into her feet. Of course she would have to talk to the Archbishop. Lady Rhea was perhaps the most important on the entire continent, and she was also the one in charge of the Officers' Academy. If anyone was going to need to talk to Shay about the night before, it would be her. Shay plastered a smile on her face, determined to falsify her confidence until she could make it real, as she nodded to Eloise. You've got it. Just lead the way. If Eloise noticed that she was lying through her teeth about knowing what she was doing, he didn't call her out on it, and Shay followed him silently through the halls of Gareg Mach. Shay once again was forced to resist the urge to stare as she walked through the monastery with wide eyes. A few times, she stopped walking to examine some extravagance or another, and Arvel had to cough in order to remind her to keep moving. Shay couldn't believe this was a place that actually existed, much less that for the students she had saved the night before, this was their regular life. If she lived this way, then she never would have bothered to take on another mercenary job again. Maybe she would keep it up as a side job, but the monastery was probably more than enough for most people. That certainly seemed to be the case for most of the Knights of Syros. Shay's nerves returned full force when she started up the stairs toward the audience chamber where Rhea was waiting, and Eloise offered her a goofy smile and some pun she didn't bother to process to try and calm her nerves. Shay took in a deep breath as Eloise opened the door and led her inside, smiling even in the face of such uncertainties. Then again, it wasn't all that uncertain for him. He probably talked with the Archbishop at least a few times a week as per his work. The Archbishop wasn't the only person in the room, Shay quickly found. Lady Rhea stood at the center of it all, her hands folded over her chest and a serene smile on her face. To Rhea's right was a man with green hair and a frown seemingly permanently painted on his features. Two other men and a woman stood off to Rhea's other side, though the two of them seemed slightly less composed than Rhea and the man with green hair. Shay swallowed back her nerves to the best of her ability, though that still didn't mean much in the face of such terrifying people as Eloise took a step toward them, undeterred and unbothered as always. Allow me to introduce the mercenary I spoke of, Eloise began, gesturing to Shay with a smile. With that, Shay forced herself to bow her head, not entirely sure of what she was meant to do to make this easier. She ultimately settled on smiling to the Archbishop and prayed that was the best choice she could have made. At the very least, the Archbishop was unbothered. Greetings. My name is Rhea, and I am the Archbishop of the Church of Syros. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for rescuing our students, she began. Her smile was constant, and it was enough to start calming the rampant tempest at the center of Shay's stomach. A small part of her felt ridiculous for having gotten so worked up about this in the first place, though she knew she was probably just being dramatic. Shay offered a brief nod to Rhea as soon as she was able to get a grip on her bearings again. I'm just glad I could help, she told the Archbishop, and something like pride bloomed in her stomach enough to make her feel like she was glowing. Maybe everything would be all right after all. Rhea let out a small laugh. How modest, she remarked more to herself than anyone else. She glanced over to her right and gestured to the man with green hair at her side. Ah, it seems I have forgotten a few important introductions. This is Seath, my right hand in leading the church. As for the others. Seath wasted no time in picking up where Rhea left off. This summons was not only a matter of gratitude. We have a proposal for you, he explained. Consider it an offer on behalf of the church itself. There went the butterflies in Shay's stomach again. Arvel just let out a snort of something Shay could only assume was meant to resemble disapproval. What kind of proposal? Shay asked. I'm certain you know about the Officers' Academy here at the monastery, yes? Seath prompted, and Shay nodded. It was kind of hard for her to have not heard of it given that she had saved a few of its students less than a day ago. We would like to have you join the academy as a student. You what? Shay cried out, unable to stomp out the strangled wheezing in her throat before it was released. Not even Arvel had a snide comment to say to that, and Shay could feel them freeze from somewhere within their shared mind. Though you are a mercenary, I understand you are not currently beholden to any one particular employer. Also, the students you rescued are close to your own age. Your life could be greatly enriched here, Ria explained with a smile. You have great strength in combat, and the Officers' Academy could be the perfect place to cultivate that power into something splendid. Arvel finally seemed to catch up with what was happening, albeit much sooner than Shay could have ever dreamed of for herself. Or she's heard about our power and wants to keep us on a short leash, they muttered crossly. This isn't just about hush money anymore. She wants to keep us quiet entirely with something more than just gold, and this is her way of doing it. Assuming it's not some kind of experiment to learn what our powers can really do. Shay glanced around at all the faces in the room: Ria, Seath, Eloise, and the three people she didn't recognize, and swallowed dryly. She had no idea how she was supposed to respond to all of this. She hadn't ever planned on this being her path forward, though she supposed nobody could have seen this coming even if they tried. Part of Shay had expected to be a mercenary forever, and the incident the night before had been a matter of convenience and chance. This could change her life forever. It would give her a new path to follow, one that didn't involve roaming freely without any company to call her own. As skilled as Shay was with a blade, she knew that she wasn't going to be able to find much in the way of employment as long as she was on her own. Most of the time, people chose to hire mercenary companies as a whole, not any solitary blades. She hadn't had as much luck as she would have liked when it came to keeping food on her plate, but the Officers' Academy had the chance to change that. If she took them up on their offer, then she would never have to worry about that again. It was a natural step when it came to keeping herself alive. How could she refuse? Shay took in a careful breath and ignored the voice in the back of her head that told her this was a bad idea. As much as she agreed that Arvel's doubts were grounded in reality, which they always were, she knew this was one offer she just couldn't pass up on. All right, Shay agreed. If you're offering, I guess there's not much I can do to turn this down, huh? Seath gave Shay a kind smile. A wise decision. We will do all we can to ensure you do not regret it. I believe you will go far here, Ria agreed with a grin of her own. Even if you didn't agree, they would have made sure you buckled and gave in eventually, Arvel said, just as much of a skeptic as always. People like this always seem to have a way of talking others into a corner in order to get what they want. At least they're heaping on the praise to make sure it doesn't crumble too soon. We can use a bit of ego fuel. With that in mind, perhaps I should introduce you to the three professors of the Officers' Academy. Eloise smiled as he gestured to the other three people in the room. Hanneman, Manuela, and Juritsa are the three professors that will be looking after each of the three houses this year. He let out a small awkward laugh before rubbing at the back of his neck. Juritsa was something of a last-minute replacement. The original professor ran off when the bandit attack began, but I can assure you that won't happen again. We're not going to let anyone get in the way of our defense of the students again. Before Eloise could continue to incriminate the church for negligence, Hanneman cleared his throat. If I may, permit me to tell you a bit more about the school itself, he began. The academy is divided into 3 houses, and it draws in the most promising young talents from every corner of Fodlan. Many are noble-born, while others spring from more humble roots, but within these walls, all are treated as equals. We ask our prospects to spend a year living under the same dormitory roof so they can challenge each other, work hard, and grow together. Shay blinked a few times as she tried to process everything he was saying, but she didn't get the chance to fully let it sink in before Manuela went on. Each of our houses corresponds to one of Fodlan's 3 regions. Edelgard leads the Black Eagle, which is for students from the Adrestian Empire. Dimitri leads the Blue Lion's House, home to students from the Holy Kingdom of Faergus. And Claude leads the Golden Deer House, for students from the Leicester Alliance, she explained. We could select a house for you ourselves, but seeing as we owe you a great debt for your work last night, we resolved to leave this decision to you, Seath said. Each of the 3 houses currently sits with the same number of students, so we would not be using you to fill in any gaps. As such, you are something of a special case. Arvel groaned again. What did I say? Short leash? They're giving us a bit of choice so they can keep an eye on us, they told Shay. After all, no person can show their true colors until you give them the leeway to show what they're made of. Shay pretended to mull over Seath's words as Arvel spoke to her. So I can join any house I want. She concluded, desperate to make sure she was hearing all of this correctly. Arvel was probably right about the reason for the special treatment and the reason behind it, but at the moment, Shay was too shocked by the fact that her future was being placed in her hands to such a degree. She would never need to wander as a sellsword again if she didn't want to. This was going to change everything. Yes, Rhea nodded. You simply have to name it. Unfortunately, the chance to choose her future came with a dark side. Shay had no idea which of the three houses she was supposed to pick, especially since she knew so little about them. She had spoken to the house leaders the night before, yes, but that hardly amounted to understanding the details of what made each of the houses something worth considering. Shay hadn't even had the time to talk with the rest of the students in each house to figure out who it was that she would get along with best. How could she make such an impossible choice that had the chance to alter her life forever? If the Officers' Academy truly ended up being her gateway to a different life, to a world where she didn't need to focus on taking on odd jobs in order to survive, then she was going to have to pick the country where she thought her future was best. Shay was from Ordelia territory in Leicester, but that didn't necessarily mean that the Golden Deer were her best option. All of the house leaders seemed nice, and Shay had no idea how to choose between the three of them without a bit more experience. As long as she had so little time to think it over though, Shay remembered what happened the night before. Edelgard had offered to let Shay come back to the Empire with her after the year ended. Edelgard had provided Shay with perhaps the first consistent work opportunity she had ever been granted. That seemed to be the only push she needed to figure out where she was meant to end up. The Black Eagles, Shay said, praying with everything she had that this was the best choice. I'd like to join the Black Eagles. May you form wonderful, lasting connections in your new house, Rhea smiled. She glanced over in Seeth's direction, anticipating his words even before he spoke. We must get to work on filling out the necessary forms for your arrival, Seeth explained. In the meantime, you can return to your class homeroom downstairs. I have no doubt the rest of the class would love to get to know you better. Rhea, Seeth, and Eloise made for the door soon afterward, and Shay was so high on her own confidence that she didn't realize Eloise, her one beacon of familiarity in this strange place, was gone until it was too late. Shay winced, but luckily for her, the conversation was moving on without her. Hanneman, Manuela, and Juritsa turned to address one another, though Juritsa was only halfway paying attention. If anything, he looked bored, and Shay couldn't help wondering how someone like that got a job as a teacher if they had so little interest in their work. Then again, if he was only the replacement teacher for the other professor that had run off, then that would certainly explain it. With that taken care of, it's time to decide which of us will supervise which house, Hanneman declared. He glanced in Juritsa's direction. Since this is your first time looking after a house after our abrupt roster change, we can give you the first choice, Professor Juritsa. Juritsa glanced around the room absent-mindedly, and Shay found herself speaking before she could hold the words back. I can already tell I'm gonna learn a lot from you, she said, hoping that would ease the atmosphere and tension around the professor. It seemed to have worked, Shay quickly found. He let out a small laugh, so small Shay almost missed it before speaking. Will you, now? Manuela let out a small coo of approval. Is that curiosity I hear in your voice, Professor Juritsa? She asked teasingly. The houses are all the same to me, Juritsa insisted, and Shay could tell this was an old argument between the three of them. Juritsa seemed to be feigning indifference though. He had to care about the situation at hand, at least to some degree. Shay just couldn't figure out what that care was supposed to mean. Perhaps you should be in charge of our new student's house then, Manuela smiled. That would have you leading the Black Eagles. Are you all right with that? Juritsa offered no response, perhaps out of spite for Manuela so merrily walking through his boundaries. Hanneman cleared his throat to fill the silence. Well, you'll certainly hear no objections from me. I can handle the Blue Lions, and Professor Manuela can take charge of the Golden Deer, he declared. It's settled then, Manuela smiled, though her grin faltered for a moment. I was anticipating a fight going into this, though I suppose this is a better outcome for all of us. The sooner we work all of this out, the sooner we can start to prepare for our first missions. Shay nodded to herself and started toward the door, hoping she had been right about accidentally leading Juritsa to pick the Black Eagles. Manuela called after Shay before the mercenary could get away. As for you, Shay, we all look forward to getting to know you much better throughout the year. Shay gave Manuela a final wave before tapping the door shut behind herself. She sighed and looked over toward the stairs, Arvel's voice ringing in her ears. With the way you hemmed and hawed over your choice, you'd think they'd at least pretend to give it the same amount of thought, they muttered under their breath. Though I suppose it's all fine now. You have consistent employment, and from the Imperial Princess, no less. I suppose this is as good an ending as we were going to get. Shay nodded. I just wonder what we're going to do from here, she admitted. I mean, I don't think we're just going to be sitting around the monastery all the time. That's not exactly a good way to get good combat experience. We'll have to see then, Arvel replied. If I had to guess, I would say each class has to go on some mission or another like what Manuela mentioned. We'll have to see how true that ends up being though. You're probably right, Shay agreed. For now though, I think we've earned a bit of rest. Let's go and talk to the rest of our new house. I'm sure they're going to want to hear from us before this first mission of ours. Navigating the monastery was much more intuitive than trying to walk through the woods, and Shay was beyond thankful for it. She was able to find the Black Eagle's classroom rather easily, and Shay stood in front of the door for a few moments before sighing and forcing herself to step inside. There was no time quite like the present, after all. Inside the classroom, Shay was met with the sight of 8 students who had to be the Black Eagles. It was relatively easy for Shay to assign names to faces based on the descriptions she had heard from Edelgard the night before, though she was sure it would take a while longer for it to stick. Then again, if she was going to be spending all her time with them from then on, then it wouldn't be an issue at all. Ah, Shay, Edelgard greeted with an easy smile. I was hoping to see you here. So, this is the mercenary you were talking about before, Casper declared as he took a step toward Shay, looking her up and down. I didn't think she was going to end up as a student based off what you told us. You can consider me shocked about it too, Shay admitted with a laugh. It was an impromptu arrangement, I suppose you could say. Still, I'm glad to be here. Welcome to the Black Eagle house, Dorothea smiled. I hope you don't find us too unfortunate of company. After all, we're set to be spending quite a bit of time together from now on. I must say, the church took a bold step in enrolling you, a decision which I, of course, fully support, Ferdinand beamed. It's a pleasure to meet you, Shay. And maybe we should actually introduce ourselves before yelling at her, Bernadetta chimed in. She stood the farthest from the center of the group, fiddling with the hem of her skirt as she watched Shay warily. The rest of the Black Eagles agreed, and they went around and said their names kindly and quickly. Shay was glad for it since it gave her the chance to test her recollection of Edelgard's words the night before. Beyond that, it was nice. Shay hadn't felt welcomed like this since she first joined up with Berling's gang, and that had been ages ago now. Shay had been on her own ever since the battle against the Ashen demon, and it was nice to have others her age she could talk to. It was a change, yes, but she was already enjoying it greatly. After everything was said and done regarding introductions, Edelgard nodded to herself. We're glad to have you with us, Shay, she reiterated. Now that all has been said and done regarding introductions, I believe we should focus on the mission to come. I believe our professor will be arriving soon with a briefing about the upcoming battle. Ugh, missions, Linhard groaned. He looked ready to fall asleep on his feet, and his eyelids drooped at Edelgard's words. Wake me up when it's over. We are to be meeting our professor soon, yes? Petra asked, completely unbothered by Linhard's laziness. I wonder who it will be. I was told it would be one of 3 people. Before Shay could explain that Juritsa was the one looking over their class, the door to the room opened, and the man himself walked inside. He still looked completely bored with the circumstances at hand, and Shay wondered if he even knew what happiness was. The Black Eagles didn't seem to mind it though, save for Bernadetta, that was, who shriveled with a whimper at the sight of him. Juritsa closed the door behind himself and looked over the Black Eagles. Our first mission has been assigned, he announced. We are to eliminate the remaining members of the Iron King's thieves that attacked the camp last night. With their leader, Costas, out of the way, only a scattering of brigands remain. And we shall defeat them handily, Edelgard smiled. Despite the terrifying words coming out of her mouth, she maintained her previous kind demeanor, and Shay made a mental note to not get on her house leader's bad side if she could avoid it. Good. Prepare yourself, Juritsa declared. He started back toward the door before anyone could try to protest his words, and Shay winced as the door closed behind him. He certainly wasn't one for small talk, though Shay had no idea how she was supposed to perceive his behavior. As far as she could tell, he was just like this, though that only seemed to open more questions. Gone quickly as always, Hubert murmured, and Shay just about jumped out of her skin from shock. She had forgotten he was there because of how quiet he had been. I see he still hasn't changed with the promotion. I don't know what you expected, Dorothea sighed. I suppose he has a certain mystique about him. If you like men who never stick around for long unless they can stab something along the way. Regardless, I believe we all know what must come next, Edelgard declared. I expect all Black Eagles to participate in this mission. We must drive out the bandits quickly together. I won't let you down, Shay assured her with a smile. Just be careful, Edelgard. If you set me loose on the bandits, there won't be any left for the rest of you. Edelgard just smiled back at her. I'll be counting on it. The Black Eagles went their separate ways to prepare for the upcoming mission, and Shay was given an official room of their own to settle down in. As it turned out, there was an extra room in the same area as the dorms in case a last-minute student was registered at the academy, and Shay was beyond thankful for it. She would have felt odd being the only student in the class who had to room away from the rest of her allies, but luckily, that wasn't a concern. There was another perk to having her own room too. If nobody else was around, then Shay wouldn't have to worry about being overheard while she spoke with Arvel. She had gotten used to responding out loud to them over the course of the last few months, and Shay somehow doubted she would be able to turn that habit off so soon. Besides, having Arvel around was comforting in its own way. With that in mind, Shay was sure to shut the door before Arvel could speak about their current circumstances. So, we're off to take out bandits. I'm sure that will be simple enough, especially with our powers, Arvel began. Just take care to not show off too much to the students. I understand that you like having an audience, but being too dramatic could cause issues. Shay let out a sound that was halfway between a scoff and a laugh. Oh, please. You're just as over the top as I am, if not more so. You have fun with this too. I know you do. Arvel laughed to themselves. Guilty as charged. They were silent for a moment before their tone went dark. And as long as we're talking, I have a request for you. I don't want you to tell anyone about me being in your mind. Shay's eyes went wide, but Arvel continued. I don't want anyone asking questions about it. I doubt you want to be labeled as crazy for it either. It would be in both of our best interests to keep this to ourselves for now. Shay nodded lightly. All right. Yeah, I can get behind that, she agreed. Unless I have your permission first, I'm not going to tell anyone about it. Promise. The somber moment was gone as quickly as it had come when Arvel continued. With that settled, we had better get ready for this mission. If you really want to leave everyone in the dust, you need to be prepared for a fight. I know you always are, but we have something to prove, don't we? Shay laughed with a nod. You've got it. I'll make sure this is a fight unlike anything they've ever seen before. They won't know what hit them. Arvel just smiled. I have no doubt you will. Check the description for the links to the author.